Chapter 526. It's not about the money. The British Empire, Fourth French Republic, and the United States of America were all watching keenly on what was transpiring in the East. It had been 2 weeks since the Imperial Japanese Navy opened fire on a German destroyer patrolling through the Bismarck Sea, and in doing so had provoked an outright war after sinking it. The Germans had opted for a largely defensive war, holding the line with colonial forces, while forcing the Imperial Japanese military into a meat grinder to bleed them dry, making use of their naval aerial assets in the region to rapidly resupply or reinforce any island or territory that might come under assault. All the while, straits were lined with mines, and German U-boats prowled beneath the ocean's surface in wolfpack formations, hunting Japanese vessels, whether military or civilian, like a pack of great white sharks who had just caught the smell of blood. Meanwhile, on the Korean peninsula, the Imperial Japanese Army was forced further and further back, trying to hold the line just north of Pyongyang, while the Russians came at them like an avalanche of steel, lead, and explosives. No doubt, this had put the other great powers of the world on edge. Japan ranked third among them all, and was being spit-roasted by the number 1 and 2 of the world, which frankly, nobody really knew which was which anymore. King George V could not help but call the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, as the two of them discussed the ongoing war in the Pacific in greater detail. I think it would be wise if you began shifting forces to the Philippines. At the current rate, the Japanese might get desperate and try to invade it if they believe your defenses to be weak there. If that is the case, then you will be dragged into the war on Germany's side, and that would complicate matters in the future. Because of this, his voice was stern and almost agitated as he made a statement that would have severe diplomatic consequences in the future. I don't give a rat's ass about the current state of the Pacific. The Philippines is the least of my problems, and frankly I'm going to have to sit this one out. Lest there won't be any continued cooperation between our two nations if I can't find a fix to this fucking problem. The silence that followed this outburst was symbolic of just how offended King George had been by it. But Hoover's following statement was truly the straw that broke the camel's back. So the next time you call me, you limey fucking bastard, it damn well better be with a fucking emergency. Because if not, blow it out your ass. Sleep deprivation was a hell of a drug, and it could make one prone to violent or aggressive behavior without them even realizing it. And thus, when Herbert Hoover hung up, he had not even understood that the words he said were severely damaging to the alliance he had fought so hard to negotiate the year before. And had he known that Bruno was the catalyst for the Black Tuesday in this life, he probably would have called King George back immediately to apologize in the most submissive manner possible. Unbeknownst to President Hoover, while he barked threats at Britain over long-distance telephone lines, the true architect of his crisis was seated calmly in a private chamber beneath the Reichsbank in Berlin, one hand swirling a glass of Riesling, the other leafing through a dossier marked confidential. NYSE Acquisitions Phase 2. Bruno von Zehntner, the Grand Prince of Tyrol, Marshal of the German Reich, and de facto master of the German economy, had been preparing for this moment since 1903. It began subtly. Over the years, Bruno had quietly purchased minority shares in key American industrials, railroads, steel, chemicals, communications, shipping. His wartime maneuvering had destroyed rival banking houses across Europe, including the Rothschilds, Bleichroders, and even remnants of British and Belgian syndicates clinging to the old order. By 1929, the man was more than just rich. He was capital incarnate, a global shadow behind the balance sheets of 1,000 companies. His reach was long, quiet, and utterly disinterested in public acclaim. When the New York Stock Exchange plummeted on Black Tuesday, Bruno did not panic. He smiled. The crash was not a catastrophe to him. It was a sale. With Germany's new imperial treasury flush from a decade of post-war expansion and colonial resource extraction, Bruno launched a series of targeted buyouts through neutral intermediaries, Panamanian shell companies, Swiss front banks, and Argentine holding firms. American icons fell one by one into his grasp: General Electric, DuPont, Union Pacific, Standard Oil of Indiana, Bethlehem Steel, RCA, and eventually even parts of Ford, whose cash-starved leadership was desperate to stay afloat. Shares, once deemed untouchable, were now bought in bulk for pennies on the dollar. By 1932, a quarter of the U.S. industrial economy answered not to Washington nor Wall Street, but to Berlin. But Bruno did not stop with America. Britain's own banking sector, already strained by French instability and the collapse of colonial revenues, began to buckle. German capital offered assistance in the form of buy-ins, mergers, and refinancing. The pound sterling teetered on the edge. The Bank of England flirted with insolvency. And through it all, Bruno kept silent. Not a speech, not a press release, no grand declarations. Because true power, he believed, did not speak. It bought. Bruno had never forged this wealth to build palaces of marble or indulge in luxuries so obscene even Plutarch might blush. No, money, like every other tool in his life, existed for one purpose alone: to be wielded. Because to Bruno, all the investments he had ever made in this life, every fortune gained, it was never about the money, but the power that it bought him. Chapter 527. It's a trap. The Imperial Japanese Navy had set its sight on the Bismarck Sea, baited by a small flotilla consisting of a single German cruiser, as well as a flank of 3 destroyers escorting it. These ships were smaller, leaner, and faster than their Japanese counterparts, which were primarily Hyuga-class battleships and Kongo-class battlecruisers. Shots rang throughout the chase, but most missed their targets horrifically. Meanwhile, the Japanese admiral in charge of the fleet continued to bark his orders at the sailors beneath his command. Do you not have eyes? They're getting away. Aim, you sons of foreign whores. The Japanese sailors, used to the abuse within their command structure, yet fanatically loyal, tried their best to obey. But launching an attack on the vertical profile of agile German cruisers was easier said than done, especially when these ships darted between islands with seemingly preternatural awareness. What the admiral failed to realize was that this was not a rout. It was a trap. As the Japanese fleet rounded a narrow strait between 2 small islands, they crossed a line into German kill zone doctrine, a doctrine born from the lessons of the Great War, refined through a decade of technological supremacy. On both sides of the strait, the jungle-covered hills revealed their true purpose: fortified artillery nests. Coastal guns, lined up with chilling precision, adjusted in unison. The targeting solutions had already been calculated. Germany no longer relied on dumb-range tables or human estimators. Thanks to Bruno's decades-long investment in fire control innovation, each artillery position was networked into a regional command node via encrypted radio signals. These nodes ran on the Z. Rechner series, vacuum tube fire control computers based on Konrad Zeuss's early architecture, accelerated by Bruno's wartime funding. These machines, Z3F for field batteries, Z3N for naval coordination, handled real-time calculations that considered radar input, atmospheric drag, velocity, wind, ship trajectory, and synchronized firing solutions across batteries. As the lead Japanese battlecruiser crossed into the firing arc, a submerged mine magnetically triggered beneath its bow. A blinding eruption of water and steel followed. The admiral barely had time to issue a reversal order when the radar pinged dozens of new signals. German U-boats rising from deeper waters in wolfpack formation. The strait, it turned out, had no escape. From the skies above, Do-217 maritime bombers swept in low, dodging flak and laying another minefield in the Japanese rear to cut off retreat. Meanwhile, inland-mounted siege cannons fired with such accuracy it was as if the very hills themselves sought vengeance. This was no accident. This was the doctrine of Bruno von Zehntner. He had abolished the battleship as obsolete, invested instead in networked kill zones, agile cruisers, and digitally assisted artillery. While Japan built monuments of steel, Bruno built weapons of intelligence. The Japanese admiral watched helplessly as another ship burst apart in flame, and finally, he understood. They were never chasing the Germans. They had been invited to die. It had been a fortnight since Japan had initiated a war against the German Reich by sinking one of its destroyers on patrol in the Bismarck Sea. What started as a war to expand and consolidate their control over the South Pacific turned into a bloodbath so horrific it was starting to seem like the end of the Empire of Japan altogether. In the South Pacific, Japan had already lost the entirety of the fleet they sent to invade the region, trapped in a decisive maneuver that single-handedly obliterated them. Even now, the Empire of Japan's Strategic High Command was scrambling for answers about how this was remotely possible. Then there was the infantry division they had sent to gain a staging point in Buka, and the air wings supporting them, all of them gone, down to the last man. This was not an overwhelming defeat. It was a slaughter of mythic proportions. The Empire of Japan had more than enough blood and steel to keep sending wave after wave of men until they repaid the debt in full. Or they would have had Russia not declared war on them in favor of their German allies immediately after the conflict began. Stretched in on two fronts, the immediate concern was to reinforce Pyongyang, currently occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army, trying its best to hold out against overwhelming force coming from the north. The Russians intended to avenge their losses at Port Arthur and Mukden a quarter of a century prior, ironically enough exasperated by Bruno's own influence at the time against those they held responsible. Battle lines held in northern Korea for now, but ammunition was running low and armor was already scrapped. Aircraft, downed before the siege even begun. An Imperial Japanese lieutenant fired his submachine gun at a rushing tide of Russian soldiers, clad in their own domestic camouflage patterns similar to the Soviet TTS-MKK from the Second World War of Bruno's past life, poked their heads over some rubble, and fired their STG-25 rifles. This was the finalized production variant of the assault rifle Germany and Russia's engineers had built in this life, blending the best parts of the HK-33 with the STG-44, while integrating an ACAM-style side rail and optics mount. It had proven highly efficient, and the 4X fixed optic with an etched BDC gave these Russian Imperial Guard infantry all the advantage as they aimed down and fired short controlled bursts at the Japanese soldiers, ducking beneath cover as the Japanese retaliated with their obsolete semi-automatic rifles chambered in 6.5 Arisaka. The Japanese lieutenant, having run dry of ammo and having no fresh magazines on hand, unsheathed his Q-Gunto and ordered a full-scale charge. Tenehika Banzai. In a desperate attempt, having run out of ammo to continue the fight without ammunition, the Japanese defenders rushed the Russian soldiers, hiding behind armored vehicles and rubble alike, not realizing their mistake as they did so. Whether it was automatic gunfire from assault rifles, magazine-fed squad automatic weapons, belt-fed general purpose and heavy machine guns, or airburst high-explosive munitions fired from the autocannons of wheeled APCs and tracked IFVs alike. The assault was an utter massacre of epic proportions and would go down in history as a worse decision than Pickett's charge, or perhaps even the charge of the Light Brigade. And in doing so, sustained such heavy casualties Pyongyang would fall into Russian hands by the dawn of the next day. Chapter 528, The Calculus of Power. The map room was filled with smoke, euphoria, and applause. Officers clustered around the glowing plotting table where Japan's losses blinked in red. Animated arrows from Russian armored divisions now pressed through Korea like the iron jaws of a bear. Naval staff watched U-boat kill confirmations scroll across the ticker feed like some surreal, blessed lottery. Yet in the center of it all, Bruno von Zehntner sat silent, hands folded, eyes half-lidded, barely acknowledging the room. The Kaiser, flushed with exhilaration, pointed toward the straight-off Buka with childlike wonder. Mein Gott, von Zehntner, you've shattered their entire Pacific fleet. And with only 4 ships and a minefield, what do we even call such a maneuver? Bruno didn't smile. He didn't even look up. He merely exhaled through his nose like a man forced to explain arithmetic to children. Ambush, kill zone doctrine, coordinated fire control, what we've rehearsed since 1920. The silence was brief, broken only by the rustling of uniformed men trying to look intelligent. Still, it's working, the Kaiser said, trying to meet Bruno's eyes. It's working better than we ever thought it could. Bruno finally turned, slowly. No, you never thought it could. I knew. That's the difference between a planner and a prophet. He stood, walking to the side table where a pot of coffee steamed beside untouched crystal. His voice was flat, dispassionate, yet absolute. Japan assumed we would fight like them. We didn't. They assumed the Reich still chased glory. We don't. We fight to end things, not prolong them. A younger general, red-faced and beaming, blurted out. Herr von Zehntner, If this continues, we'll push them back to Hokkaido by next year. Bruno glanced over his shoulder. I don't want Hokkaido, he said. I want leverage. Let them feel the burn of defeat, but leave enough pride that they come to the table without humiliation. This isn't conquest. It's deterrence. The room quieted. Even the Kaiser no longer spoke. Bruno stirred his coffee once. No sugar. No milk. Just bitter black, the only thing that matched his philosophy of war. He turned back to the map. And tell the Russians, they may have Pyongyang, but they are not to take Tokyo. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Why not? Bruno's eyes narrowed. Tokyo is not a prize. It is a symbol, and symbols, when desecrated, create martyrs instead of lessons. The world must not see a humiliated Japan. They must see a disciplined one, subdued, not shattered. The officers nodded their heads in understanding before breaking out into laughter again, raising glasses, gesturing animatedly over maps and reports. The scent of victory filled the war room like expensive cologne, artificial, fleeting, overapplied. Have you seen the casualty estimates from Pyongyang? Crowed General Lowenstein. 700 dead Russians, over 5,000 Japanese. We have, snorted another. Ypres was a charnel pit. This is elegant. Clean, like the blade of a surgeon. Thank God for Zeus's fire control computers. And those new 80mm self-adjusting fuses. We're 20 years ahead of the world. All eyes turned to Bruno, expecting some rare moment of pride. But the architect of it all said nothing. He simply stood at the far end of the room, watching the ticker scroll. Pulse steady, eyes cold. Not joy, not even satisfaction. Just measurement, evaluation, contingency. The generals toasted, oblivious to the future their laughter would never see. They believed in the present. Bruno lived 5 years ahead of it. They don't understand, he thought. They never do. This technology, these fire control networks, subsonic jet-assisted artillery, fast attack cruisers, were already obsolete. Privately, production had already shifted toward the next paradigm. Turboprop-powered aircraft, carrier-based naval doctrine, stealth and ballistic submarines, wire-guided missile platforms, and so much more. There were even early prototypes of Fort Defender 2 style plate carriers and composite Level 4 grade plates being trialed in Königsberg. Not to mention advanced composite materials for new production E-Series armored vehicles and early explosive reaction armor equivalents. What was fielded now? Just the already aging bones of last decade's revolution. The tools of a reserve army. Weapons meant for Lend-Lease programs, neo-colonial suppression, or proxy state redistribution. The true arsenal of the Reich remained sealed, underground, unspoken. Because Bruno knew something they didn't. Victory today meant nothing if tomorrow turned against them. He remembered 1919. He remembered 1945. He remembered 2015. He remembered the world that punished Germany for daring to exist. He would not let that happen again. Not now. Not ever. There were bunkers beneath the Alps. Others in the Sudetenland. Sealed vaults buried under Tyrol. Inside them were canisters and devices that no flag bore. Some chemical. Some thermobaric. And some theoretical. One warhead, marked Project Morgenrod, remained under constant development and observation by a scientific detachment loyal only to him. Its yield, calculated at 20 kilotons, was never tested, never needed. But it existed, as did 5 others. Atomic deterrence by implication alone. He took a sip of his coffee, still silent, and watched the officers toast a war already won. Let them celebrate, he thought. Let them toast maps and machines. They need not know what's necessary to keep the demons at bay. But I do. Like Saint Michael before the gates of heaven, I stand watch. The dragon still sleeps, but I will be the one to slay it, should the time come. The weapons buried beneath the Alps, the Sudetenland, and Tyrol were not built for conquest. They were built for retribution. Insurance against the unthinkable. Because if the German fatherland were ever to fall, if its soil were ever occupied, its people broken, its sovereignty erased, then the world would burn with it. No Versailles. No Weimar. No surrender. Only fire. Only ash. Bruno's final contingency. Never again would Germany die alone. Call it what they will, madness, obsession, heresy. But to Bruno, It was math. If X equals collapse, then Y must equal extinction. The threat alone was meant to suffice, but with every threat, if one did not have the might backing it, then it was utterly pointless. Chapter 529, Echoes on the Wire. They thought the war would be fought with tanks and planes. But Bruno knew better. Wars were not won by firepower alone, but by foresight. In 1910, his agents helped wire the first transcontinental telephone line. In 1915, his shell corporations quietly funded the Rural Expansion Act. By 1920, proprietary switchboard tech, licensed through innocuous front companies, was embedded in AT&T, Bell, and Western Union. Not one phone, not one wire, not one signal moved through an American government building without first passing through his system. The Capitol, monitored. The War Department, transcribed. The Federal Reserve, logged. Even the Oval Office's so-called secure line routed briefly through a nondescript relay station, installed by a trusted private vendor, which, of course, traced back to a manor outside Potsdam. And every night, at 0200 Berlin time, the day's recordings, compressed, indexed, translated, were couriered to Abteilung 12 of the Gross's General Stab. There, behind cipher-sealed bronze vaults, linguists and analysts parsed everything from agricultural subsidies to naval procurement memos. They didn't guess Washington's intentions. They already knew. Bruno rarely spoke during high-level meetings about America. What was there to say? They speak into our ears and call it freedom. Only one American had ever uncovered the truth, President Charles Evans Hughes. But by the time he realized the depth of German infiltration, it was already too late. Whether out of fear, defeat, or a quiet understanding that resistance was futile, he told no one. Every plot, every backroom deal, every secret, documented, archived, on ice. If ever unleashed, the evidence would collapse the American state from within. Bruno didn't need tanks in Washington. He had tape, transcripts, and timing. The American media, radio, press, even early television tech ferried in via German intermediaries, would erupt with scandal. The result? Civil war. Or revolution. Maybe both. A republic devoured by its own illusions. But Herbert Hoover didn't know this. He thought himself discreet. He thought Britain's help would buy him leverage. He thought Bruno could be boxed out. He was wrong. In Berlin, Bruno sipped black coffee while reviewing the latest batch of tapes. Hoover's voice crackled through the headset, livid and desperate. What the hell do you mean Standard Oil stock has been bought up? By whom? Who the hell has that kind of cash? You don't know? Well, you'd better find out, or I'll have your guts for garters. Bruno nearly choked. He had to suppress a laugh with a swig of coffee as the door creaked open. Heinrich von Koch entered, looking miraculously 5 years younger than the last time Bruno had seen him. If I didn't know better, Bruno smirked, I'd say you finally found a woman to make an honest man out of you. Instead of scowling, Heinrich shot back smoothly. Laugh all you want. Just don't hate me because an old dog still has teeth. Bruno nearly dropped his mug. Are you fucking kidding me? Now, in your 50s? You're getting married? To who? Heinrich brushed him off and took a seat, speaking with practiced calm. I'm old, Bruno. It just took a while to admit it. Not all of us are frozen in time like you. You don't age, you just refine. But me? After all you left to marry your son, the house got quiet. Bruno blinked, stunned. When he finally spoke, it came out harsher than he meant. Alia and Erwin have been married for over a decade. Their oldest is almost 13. You're just now realizing this. Heinrich grunted, trying to defuse the tension. Shut the fuck up and be happy for me, will you? Bruno exhaled through a grin, then chuckled until he had to wipe his eyes. Fine. So who is it? You wouldn't know her, Heinrich said. Third daughter of a countess from Württemberg. Half my age. Our families have ties. It makes sense. Bruno leaned back, smiling wickedly. So the notorious Heinrich von Koch, playboy, duelist, rake of the Rhine, finally settles down, with someone younger than his own daughter. That's poetry. Heinrich glared. You're an ass. And you're a cradle robber, Bruno replied. I look forward to the wedding. Bruno sat alone once Heinrich had gone, sipping what remained of his coffee. The sun outside had begun its descent behind the snow-dusted rooftops of Berlin, casting long shadows across the parquet floor. He didn't expect to be disturbed again that evening. until a knock came at the door. "Come in," Bruno called without looking up. The door creaked open, and a boy's voice, unsteady but determined, cut through the quiet. "Grandfather?" Bruno looked up. It was Eric, Erwin's eldest. Nearly 13 now, broad-shouldered for his age, with his father's pale eyes and his mother's dark, straight hair. He carried himself with a military stiffness, though the oversized coat he wore made him look like a child trying on a soldier's uniform. "What brings you here at this hour?" Bruno asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I was told you were listening to tapes again," Eric said as he sat. "Father says it's rude to disturb you during state business, but I thought you might have a moment." Bruno tilted his head. The boy's tone was measured, too formal for someone so young. "I always have a moment for you," Bruno replied, quietly setting the earpiece aside. "What's on your mind?" Eric hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded pamphlet, creased, dog-eared. A cadet recruitment brochure. Bruno's brow furrowed slightly. "I found this," Eric said, "at the academy. I've been reading it every day." "You've years before you can apply," Bruno said calmly. "And your father?" "My father wants me to become a diplomat," Eric interrupted, surprising even himself. "To study languages, economics, trade negotiations." He looked down, fingers gripping the pamphlet like a shield. "But I want to be like you." The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a match. Bruno leaned back, observing the boy not as a grandfather, but as a judge might weigh a defendant, eyes unreadable, features carved from stone. "You want to fight wars," Bruno said flatly. "No," Eric answered, his voice cracking for a moment before regaining strength. "I want to protect the Reich. Like you do." Bruno was silent. "You saved us," Eric went on, voice growing more impassioned. "Father says that despite fighting enemies in the East, the South, and the West, you were there breaking through the line and forcing the enemies to capitulate." A pause. "The Serbians, the Ottomans, the Italians, the French, and the British. They were incapable of taking an inch of German soil because of you. You protected our borders. You protected our way of life. You protected our family, and I want to do the same." He looked up, eyes wide. "I want to help do that. I don't want to sit in offices and sign papers while other men die." Bruno closed his eyes just for a moment. So young, he thought. So certain. And yet, wasn't he the same at that age? A boy with fire in his blood and a vision in his mind? Back when he had still been Karl, just a weary old man reborn into a world that didn't know what it was about to awaken. He looked at his grandson again, not as a child, but as a possible heir to something greater than blood. "You know nothing of war, Eric," he said at last. "You think there's honor and glory in warfare? But there isn't. There's fear. Fear and blood." Despite Bruno's warnings, Eric did not yield. His position stiffened as he reasserted his claim. "I want to learn." Bruno's tone was stern and decisive in his response. "You will, but not yet." Bruno stood and moved toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You see a Reich victorious. You see strength, power, respect. But what you don't see are the coffins behind every treaty, the empty chairs at every feast." He turned slightly, eyes catching Eric's in the glass reflection. "When I go to war, I do so with a heavy hand and a heavier heart. You cannot lead men into hell with just ambition. You need to carry their names when they don't come home." Eric said nothing. "I built this Reich so men like you wouldn't have to die," Bruno continued. "But if war comes again, and it will, then it must be men like you who end it." Silence again. Then Bruno walked back to the desk and placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. "You will learn what it means to serve, but you will not learn it through pamphlets or parades. You'll learn it from me." Eric's eyes lit up. "You mean?" "I'll teach you, personally. History, politics, war, strategy. You will not become a soldier," Bruno said, "until you understand the burden of command." The boy stood up, nearly forgetting to salute in his excitement before realizing this was not an officer, but his grandfather. Bruno waved him off. "Go home. It's late." "Yes, grandfather." As the door clicked shut behind him, Bruno returned to his desk. He picked up the earpiece again, but didn't put it back on. He simply sat there, staring into the distance. The future had just walked into his office, and it bore his name. A single thought escaped Bruno's lips, in a whisper so low only he could hear it. I won't let him suffer the same fate. Chapter 530 of Wine, Rings, and Regret. The castle loomed over the Württemberg countryside like an aging veteran, dignified, worn, and stubbornly upright. Much like Heinrich von Koch himself, Bruno adjusted his cuffs with the kind of irritation reserved only for formal events. The road had been muddy. His greatcoat was wrinkled. And worse, he hadn't had his second cup of coffee. In the distance, string music floated from the chapel entrance. Too cheerful by half. Heinrich was getting married. Madness, Bruno muttered as he climbed the stone steps. He just had to choose a cold winter morning in the countryside for the venue. Is it just me, or is Heinrich deliberately fucking with me? Heidi giggled and shook her head as she hugged her man tightly, a bit too intimately at such a formal venue, all the while whispering in his ears. Aside from myself, he is perhaps the person who knows you best, after all. But don't blame him too harshly. I was the one who set the time, date, and location. After saying this, Heidi broke away from Bruno's arms, running off like she was a woman half her age. Bruno could not help but linger and watch, shaking his head with a smirk on his face as he did so. The interior of the castle was lit with gold-tinged chandeliers and the heavy aroma of incense and roses. Nobles, some ancient, some freshly minted, milled about in full regalia. Men in epaulettes, women in pearls, cousins with pristine manners and poisonous ambitions. Bruno moved through them like a wolf among lapdogs fattened on diplomacy and gossip. A few bowed, most parted like the sea. He arrived just as Heinrich stood at the altar, resplendent in a tailored uniform more ceremonial than functional. The bride beside him looked almost ethereal, tall, pale, dark-eyed, with a veil that shimmered like frost. Anneliese von Zehntner, third daughter of a respectable but broke house. Bruno's first thought upon seeing her was, she knows. She knew who Heinrich was, what he was, and still, she was here. Wealth, glory, and prestige had a way of winning over a woman's heart, and the medals pinned to Heinrich's chest made him look 2 decades younger than he actually was. But nobody mentioned such a silent truth as the ceremony began. The officiant droned. Vows were exchanged. Bruno nearly dozed off until Heinrich stumbled slightly while placing the ring. Still nervous after all these years? Bruno whispered dryly, standing by his side as the best man. Heinrich didn't respond, but the twitch of his eyebrow said everything. The reception was held in the old hunting hall, refitted for the event. Musicians played waltzes. Servants passed champagne and heavy wines. The smell of roast duck and spiced game lingered in the air. Bruno found a corner to steal a moment of peace. Formal events such as these had always been suffocating to him. He had enjoyed his children's own weddings, but that was from a place of paternal happiness, not natural gregariousness. However, that peace lasted all of 12 minutes before being intruded upon. You're not even pretending to enjoy yourself, Heinrich said, approaching with 2 glasses. What can I say? No matter how old I get, no matter how many of these formalities I attend, I still can't grow accustomed to it. Too many people, too many threats lurking in the shadows. Heinrich chuckled. Paranoid as usual, I see. God, you're insufferable. At least pretend like you're happy for your best friend, while scanning the room for your imagined enemy. Bruno took a deep breath and sighed, adjusting the medals hanging from his collar, as he grabbed hold of the wine in Heinrich's hand and drank it in one giant swig. His demeanor loosened afterward, as did his smile. You married a woman half your age, in a castle, while wearing a full dress uniform, and I'm the insufferable one. They clinked glasses. Heinrich raised a brow as he gave Bruno a complete look over with a judging gaze and matching tone. Says the guy who wore the full ceremonial regalia of a Russian field marshal in St. Isaac's Cathedral, like he owned the place for his daughter's wedding. Are you really one to cast judgment upon me, when you have done far worse? Bruno's retort caught in his throat, as he realized he had indeed gone a bit far with the festivities when celebrating the marriages of his own children. Yet here, for his best friend, he had reverted to his usual paranoid and antisocial ways. Heinrich continued as he let Bruno catch a breather. Besides, she's good for me, Heinrich said after a moment. She sees something in me, something that only Alia could ever see before her. Bruno scoffed. Yeah, trauma. Isn't that the reason you and your daughter got along so well? What do they call it? Trauma bonded. Fuck you. Heinrich's tone was half genuine, half playful as the two men broke out into laughter over their shared war or words. But behind the mirth, there was something real in Heinrich's eyes. A kind of peace Bruno hadn't seen in him since before the trenches. I'm happy for you, Bruno said, sincerity slipping through the sarcasm. Even if your daughter could be her stepmother. Shut up. Later, Bruno was dragged into giving a toast. He stood before the hall, glass raised, eyes half lidded with fatigue and wine. Ladies, gentlemen, nobles of varying degrees of legitimacy. I've known Count Heinrich von Koch since we both chose the incredibly foolish profession of becoming infantry officers. Had we known a great war was about to break out in the decade following our commitment, I like to think that at the very least I would have chosen a more secure means of employment. With that said, my friend here is arrogant, stubborn, often morally questionable, and on at least 3 occasions he's been shot for reasons I will not disclose in polite company. But he's also the best man I've ever had the misfortune to serve beside. Loyal to a fault, brave beyond reason, and now somehow married. To Anneliese, who has my condolences and my admiration. May you find joy in each other's madness. To the bride and groom. He drank. The hall erupted in polite applause and a few stifled cackles. Heinrich mouthed the words, "You bastard." Bruno smiled and bowed. As the night wore on, Bruno wandered to the balcony, looking out at the moonlit vineyards below. The stars were out. Music wafted behind him. Footsteps approached. It was Anneliese. He's asleep on a bench, she said softly. Your toast nearly killed him. Bruno didn't turn. Good. He needed the nap. You don't think I'm good for him, do you? He paused, then turned to her. On the contrary, I think you are exactly the force of stability he needs in his life now that he no longer has his adopted daughter to live for. Bruno went silent for all of 3 seconds, composing his thoughts properly before giving voice to their power. Besides, you're not some doe-eyed fool. You clearly care for him more than money and medals, which is more than I can say for most who have tried to win his favor over the years. And he's never been one to let something go once he's chosen it. She looked out over the vineyards with him. And here I thought you disapproved of our circumstances. Bruno chuckled as he shook his head before turning around from the railing of the balcony, looking the beautiful young bride in the eyes as he spoke his piece. 2 of my sons are married or engaged to women 9 years their senior. One of them is Heinrich's adopted daughter. I would be a bit of a hypocrite if I approved of such relationships, but not the one you share with my sworn brother. I hold no judgment, only concern for a man who has bled enough for my ambitions. A silence. Thank you for coming, she said at last. Bruno nodded. Then, quietly, take care of him. He's braver than he is wise. The woman turned, the wind causing her pure white dress to skirt along with it. And then she stopped, silence, followed by a single statement. I know. That's why I said yes. Bruno had once imagined Heinrich would die alone, gun in hand, surrounded by smoke and silence. But Alya changed that. Now Anneliese had picked up where she left off, though with far gentler hands. Bruno left before dawn, coat flung over one shoulder, the faintest smile playing on his lips. Weddings were usually awful, or, for that matter, any formal gathering of such scale and grandeur. But this one, strangely, didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. And those were rare enough to be worth remembering. Still, there was a certain sadness in his chest. Heinrich had finally grown up, but his heart bled for what could have been between Eric and Louise. What could never be because of his own failures. It was a burden of guilt he would never be fully rid of. Yet on this day, Bruno chose not to reflect on it for longer than necessary, and instead embraced the winds of change that had finally come for a stubborn old man. Chapter 531. Annexing Silingen. With Pyongyang fallen and the southern Korean peninsula within reach, the Empire of Japan began mass mobilization without hesitation. What had started with a small number of active divisions, and fleets believing victory would be swift and decisive rapidly turned into a national project. Meanwhile, the United States began to fear that Japan might make a move on their Pacific territories. In particular, the matter of the Philippines was a serious one. Since the Great War reached its height in 1915, and the flames of the anti-colonial sentiment were fanned by the German Reich, particularly in the region. Armed groups had been gathering, training, and performing low-scale urban attacks against U.S. military presence across the Philippines. An issue that was largely absent from the public eye, as these attacks occurred infrequently and were not severe enough for Americans back home to become educated about, let alone press a resolution for. But to the Hoover administration, already fumbling the economy, with the stock market in freefall and Bruno consolidating control over the last untouched sectors of American industry, the Philippines represented a looming catastrophe. The Philippines was a flashpoint of potentially catastrophic outcomes, and currently, those fears were about to be fully realized. Largely armed with smuggled surplus from the Great War, Mosin Nagants from Siberia, Arisakas off-sunken freighters, and Mausers funneled through Indochina, the insurgents were ready. And the world was about to remember the name they had once annexing Silingen. It was March of 1930, in the Luzon, Philippine archipelago near Camp John Hay, an American military facility. The checkpoint wasn't even a mile past the tree line, but it may as well have been another continent. Ringed by barbed wire and sandbags, the outer defense post had been manned by the same underpaid Marine reservists for nearly 6 months. No attacks, no threats, just the occasional fruit vendor being hassled by officers drunk on their own authority. They called it the boredom station. No one expected it to be the opening shot of the uprising, but the men waiting in the hills did. Camouflaged under burlap and banyan bark, they crept into position with meticulous calm. A pair of crewmen disassembled a stolen Colt Browning water-cooled machine gun, setting it up beneath a fallen log overlooking the road. The others clutched German Mauser C96 broom handles fitted with full-length wooden stocks, converted to carbines during the Balkan proxy wars and now repurposed for jungle revolution. Whether Germany had actually supplied them, or they were bolt third-hand from a long line of other revolutionary forces before them, nobody really knew. The serial numbers and Waffen-amps were ground off long ago, making them sanitized and untraceable. In total, they were 12 men, 12 ghosts. No flags, no uniforms, just iron, oil, and hate. The leader, a wiry Tagalog speaker named Luke Ban, raised a single clenched fist. 3 seconds later, hell broke loose. The machine gun opened first, stitching a line of .3006 into the watchtower. The sentry on duty barely had time to scream before the round split his ribcage like dry bamboo. Muzzle flashes erupted from the hills, lighting the fog with brutal precision. Luke Ban himself fired 2 bursts from his Mauser, walking down the first Marine who broke for cover. Another revolutionary lobbed a homemade grenade, built in a Davo tool shed from scrap, soap, and dynamite, over the sandbags and into the motor pool. The blast flipped a parked truck and lit the gasoline barrels like bonfires. Alarms howled. Return fire sputtered from the central barracks, but the compound was lightly staffed. This was a rear area station, not a frontline post. The Americans weren't prepared. Not for this. Within 7 minutes, the battle was over. 11 Americans lay dead. 2 more would bleed out by the time reinforcements arrived. The Filipino fighters vanished into the jungle before air support could be scrambled from Clark. But they didn't disappear quietly. On the front gate, burned into the wooden beam with a soldering iron, was a single symbol. A white sun inside a red triangle. And below it, painted in white ash. This land belongs to Filipinos. Your empire is a house built on sand. In the heartland of the United States, a gathering was held following the aftermath in the Philippines. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and rising panic. Secretary of War Hurley slammed the latest intelligence report onto the mahogany table, scattering coffee cups and half-read dispatches. 11 dead, 5 wounded, and another 2 of our supply convoys bombed in Luzon this month. President Herbert Hoover didn't look up from his chair. His fingers tapped the edge of his desk in tight, arrhythmic bursts. And who the hell are these annexing Silingen? Brigadier General MacArthur, barely back from his advisory tour, spoke first. They're not new, sir. Just reborn. Descendants of Aguinaldo's men. Jungle-trained, fanatically nationalistic, and well-armed. I warned the War Department in 28 that Manila wasn't as quiet as it looked. Hoover rubbed his temples. Why now? Because we're weak now, said Secretary Mellon, leaning forward. The markets collapsed, We're hemorrhaging gold, and Congress won't even approve funds for the Pacific Fleet's modernization. They smell blood. And that's not all, MacArthur added grimly. Some of the weapons recovered were German surplus. Balkan-issue Mausers. Old MG-01/05S. We've seen this pattern before. They're not just scavenging, someone's feeding them. Silence fell. Everyone knew the implication. Germany. Hoover stood, slow and heavy. I want naval readiness drills around Subic Bay. I want all cables from Manila reviewed. All of them. I don't care who owns the damn wires. And I want a blacklist of every sympathizer in the colony. MacArthur nodded. Already preparing lists, sir. But we need to be careful. If we crack down too hard, we push the moderate factions into the arms of the radicals. Hoover's eyes narrowed. Let them be radicals. Then we have reason to put them down without apology. It did not take long for Tokyo to gather intelligence of what was happening in America's South Pacific territories. The polished floor of the Imperial General Staff building was a mirror of lacquered discipline. Ministers in military dress stood at attention as General Igaki placed a map of the Philippines on the table, marked in red ink. Gentlemen, a unique opportunity has emerged. He tapped the Luzon region, where clusters of small explosions were inked with kanji annotations. Ambush. Convoy destroyed. Police outpost razed. The Americans are vulnerable. Their colony is unstable. Their troops are overstretched. And their public is distracted. Prime Minister Inukai was cautious. Are we sure this annexing Silingen is not simply another nationalist dream doomed to die in the jungle? General Igaki smiled thinly. Even dreams are useful, if timed correctly. An admiral chimed in. And if the Americans are provoked into overreaction, we gain diplomatic cover to intervene, humanitarian, peacekeeping, or protective occupation of certain strategic islands. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the table. Igaki leaned in. We already have ships ready to depart to the region. The Germans may have sunk our initial expeditionary fleet, but that does not mean we are finished just yet. Another voice chimed in, old and wise. Still, I would suggest an advisory capacity, and perhaps a shipment of older arms that are currently rusting in storage. We are at war, and Pyongyang has fallen. What we need is deniability and the timing. A young intelligence officer entered, bowing deeply, and presented a folder. From our embassy in Manila, he said. We have confirmed reports that several cells of the annexing Silingen have sent envoys to Hong Kong and Taipei. They're seeking external backers. That got the room's attention. Then we shall answer, Igaki said. In the center of Manila, Colonel James Whitford stood on the balcony of the Malacanang Palace, staring out at the bay, dark and vast. Behind him, his aide read the latest intercepted message aloud. Transmission from Cebu, the storm has begun. Lightning in the sugar fields. Tell Talum to cut the wire and bleed the copper snake. Whitford turned. Poetic little bastards, aren't they? Sir, we found wire-cutting equipment, demolition charges, and German rifles at the Devo warehouse. They're more than poetic. He nodded slowly. This isn't going to be like Samar. These people aren't hiding anymore. They're coming out in the open. He tapped the ash off his cigarette and watched the embers fall. While the Americans plotted in the open, in the shadows of Manila, 3 men sat in a candlelit warehouse. One wore a priest's collar. The other 2 bore old military coats, Spanish-era relics. On the table, a worn copy of Cartilia in Katipunan, beside a map of the city marked with targets, power stations, guard posts, police headquarters. One man, known only as Talum, spoke quietly. The Americans think this is about freedom, but it is not. He placed his finger on the telegraph center. This is about control. Control of information. Control of fear. Control of what happens next. The others nodded. The priest handed him a letter, stamped with the seal of the Hong Kong liaison. Our friends in Taipei have agreed to meet. This war has only just begun. Chapter 532. Overworked and underappreciated. The war in the Philippines had caught Bruno off guard. He had heard whispers of movements rising in the east, but his focus had been elsewhere. Whether it was the hostile takeover of American industry and infrastructure, the war in New Guinea against the Japanese, or simply Heinrich's wedding, Bruno's schedule had been packed. He had spent months in Berlin away from his family, living in the office of the German Army's general staff, sleeping at his desk or on a spare bunk in the barracks. showering, and performing other basic hygiene alongside enlisted soldiers. It was a far cry from the comfort he enjoyed as Supreme Marshal of the realm while living in Tyrol. The title was unofficial, something he had coined himself to reflect his position, not only as Chief of Staff within the German Armed Forces, but as the man whom all the branches and their leadership regarded as their superior. Still, he felt like a young man at the academy again. And for someone already 50 years of age, the nostalgia had long worn off. His children were getting older. The eldest among them were approaching their 30s, while the youngest, born in 1915, still had a few years left before adulthood. Some of his grandchildren were now in their teenage years. All Bruno wanted was to be close to his family and command from his private office in the grand palace he had built. But in a time of war, proximity to the Kaiser was non-negotiable, and so he remained in Berlin. As Bruno dozed at his desk, he was stirred by a voice. "He's fallen asleep. The man is clearly overworked. Can't you ask your sister to speak with her husband and get the Kaiser to lighten his load? Father isn't as young as he used to be." Recognizing the voice of his daughter-in-law, Bruno grumbled and raised his hand. "I'll have you know I'm very much awake." Your shrill voice saw to that. "Alia, dear." Alia stared at her father-in-law, now risen like a vampire from its coffin. The bags beneath his eyes silenced her ire and replaced it with concern. "It's worse than I thought. Father, shall I fetch you some water? Or coffee, perhaps?" Bruno rubbed his eyes, then the bridge of his nose, and finally his temples. "Beer." Alia hesitated, disapproving, but Erwin shot her a glance that urged compliance. She walked off in search of the nearest pitcher. Meanwhile, Erwin sat in front of his father, his voice a mix of concern and teasing. "You really do look like shit. She's not exaggerating. How much are you sleeping these days, father?" Bruno narrowed his eyes. "And since when do you speak to your father that way, boy? Will you be swearing like a sailor in front of your mother next?" Erwin stiffened. "Sorry, sir. Bruno waved it off, scoffing as he reached for his flask. "I'm just joking. Nobody's around to witness this conversation. Speak freely. You're a man now, right? Surely a little banter won't hurt." He opened the flask, only to find it empty. His disappointment was almost childlike. Erwin chuckled and handed him his own. "Take mine. But if the wife asks, it's yours. She doesn't need to know I sometimes take the edge off." Bruno gave his son a long look, then drank, pocketing Erwin's flask and returning his own to the desk. "Like father, like son. Just don't start smoking. It's a filthy habit. Took me years to quit. Now, enough of this bullshit. What are you two doing here at this hour?" Alia returned with a comically oversized stein, which Bruno took with surprise and appreciation. "See, Alia, this is why you're my favorite daughter-in-law. Don't get me wrong, Sophie is a wonderful young lady, but she doesn't show me the love you do." Alia rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I love you so much that after I get home, I'm calling your wife to tell her how haggard you've become and that your drinking habit has returned. I'm sure she'll love to hear it." Erwin looked at his wife as if she had just triggered a bad ending. But Bruno was far from anxious. In fact, he was so relaxed he simply leaned back in his chair and smirked. "I wonder if it would be better if you did. Wilhelm may be the Kaiser, but even he fears that woman's fury. Nothing angers her more than when I'm treated poorly. Go ahead, Alia. Make my day. I could use a vacation." Alia pouted, defeated by Bruno's superior wit. Erwin finally broke the moment. "Father, Alia and I were wondering, could our family move into the palace in Tyrol with you?" Bruno said nothing at first, sipping from his beer and fixing them with a gaze that made them both uncomfortable. "Took you long enough to ask. I thought I'd die of old age before you grew a pair." Alia was shocked, not just by the vulgarity, but by the implication of approval. Erwin blinked. "Wait, is that a yes?" Bruno looked exasperated. "Why the hell do you think I built such an ostentatious monument to wealth and opulence? You know I hate that sort of wasteful spending. It was for the future of our family, all generations of it. You think I built that many halls, wings, and bunker complexes for hosting dinner parties? I built it so you, your siblings, your children, their children, everyone, would always have a home. Frankly, I've been meaning to ask, with how many kids you two have, that old manor must be bursting at the seams." There was silence, then laughter, as Alia and Erwin realized how foolish they had been to worry. Bruno, despite the war, despite the weight of empire on his shoulders, was still a father, still a patriarch. And for all his cunning, ambition, and ruthlessness, he wanted only one thing now: to be surrounded by family, and to see that the future he fought for had a home to call its own. Chapter 533: A Convergence of Interests. While Washington was in deadlock, arguing on whether or not the most recent wave of insurrection in their South Pacific holdings required immediate action or simple reprisal, the colonel in charge of Manila's garrison had taken it upon himself to act without orders from the suits in charge. Frankly speaking, Colonel James Whitford had run out of patience in dealing with these attacks from a reactive standpoint. Their rules of engagement were woefully inefficient. They were waiting to be attacked in order to return fire. And the hit-and-run tactics the enemy used made that damn near impossible to fight effectively. Because of this, he had summoned the big guns. The Philippines were not exactly a territory teeming with armor, but artillery? They had some leftover guns from the Spanish-American War and the First Philippine Insurrection that could get the job done. Towed into firing range by motorized transport, the American Army set up the artillery at just the right distance. All the while, the officer in charge of the regiment gave the command: "Open fire." The guns echoed like thunder, so much so that the locals genuinely thought a storm had conjured itself. And they were half right about that. A storm had suddenly appeared, but it was not one of thunder, lightning, and rain. Rather, it was fire and fury from an angry god. And that god was the United States Army. The olive drab-clad artillery soldiers plugged their ears as the shots rang out, sending shells downrange with artillery that, on any other battlefield, would be considered obsolete. Their target? An unsuspecting rural village, which intelligence suggested was harboring members of Anak and Silingen. The village was allegedly being used as a safe house and storage hub. Arms, munitions, and ordnance were said to be located there. Because of this, Colonel James Whitford ordered it be removed from the map entirely. And so it was. The citizens of the village cried out in agony as their homes were destroyed, their loved ones engulfed in the blast, and they themselves wounded by flame and shrapnel alike. Then, after the artillery barrage had concluded, the infantry moved in, bayonets affixed, rifles loaded. Their orders were simple: eliminate any survivors and scour the wreckage for proof of the village's sins. Thus, a bloody cleanup began, one that would be far more disastrous for the United States Army than they initially expected. Back in Manila, word of the bombardment spread fast. Survivors, those few who had fled before the shells fell, arrived in nearby towns covered in soot and blood, wailing of fire from the sky, and steel-hearted soldiers who stabbed the wounded where they lay. Church bells rang for the dead, and whispers of the Manila massacre began to circulate, even among loyalist communities. What began as a secretive rebellion now took on the weight of martyrdom, its flames fanned not by ideology, but by grief. And as funerals were held in silence, and fists clenched over fresh graves, many who once hesitated now found their hearts hardened, ready to answer the call to arms. In the city of Taipei, Luke Ban sat, dressed in normal civilian clothing, drinking a beer locally brewed at an innocuous establishment. By his side were two other Filipino men, both young adults, short hair, clean-shaven, and of a fit build, clearly military, or at the very least paramilitary, types to those who knew the signs to look for. Eventually, a man sat down across from them, flanked by two similar-looking younger men. However, these three were Japanese, not Filipino. Even so, they greeted Luke Ban and his men in perfect Tagalog. The Emperor sends his well wishes. Due to the circumstances we find ourselves in with the Russians and the Germans, we can't be seen supplying or training you directly. But we have intelligence, weapons, munitions, and most importantly, advisors who can assist you in your operations. Luke Ban naturally knew these things would not come without some conditions, and thus, he was quick to voice these very thoughts. Let me guess. All your emperor asks of us is that we kneel and be eternally loyal as his subjects the moment we throw off the yoke of the Americans? The Japanese officer received strange glances from his subordinates, but said nothing, simply eyeing them in a way that silently told them to restrain themselves. He then fixed his civilian tie before clearing his throat. That is to be expected, yes. Luke Ban surprised everyone at the table when he responded swiftly. Deal. You give us what we need, and you can expect your generosity reciprocated, but only after we have won the war and driven every foreigner out of our lands." There was a shake of hands and an agreement made between the two parties, with further details to be communicated at a later date. As for Luke Ban, the moment they were out of earshot of the Japanese, his men interrogated him on the spot. "What the hell, man? We trade one master for another? What? Just because they're Asian you think they'll be any better?" Luke Ban looked at the revolutionary as if he were an idiot, and his tone was equally accusatory. "Not in the slightest. Did you hear what I said? Your generosity will be reciprocated, but only after we have driven every foreigner out of our lands. I never said I would kneel before them and accept them as our overlords. After all, the Japanese are foreigners to our lands too, aren't they?" The two men stared at their fearless leader as if he were the most brilliant man they had ever met. "Sir, you're a fucking genius." Luke Ban, apparently lacking humility, wrapped his arms around the shoulders of the two men while completely agreeing with them. "I know." Luke Ban and his men would only learn of the massacre outside Manila after they had returned to their homeland. And when they did, they didn't know whether to grieve or rejoice. Because the U.S. Army's actions had stirred the public to such an extent, they now had a long list to recruit new soldiers from. All the while, Washington would continue to bicker over how to solve the solution, until bodies piled up and American citizens began to notice their own were coming home in caskets from a part of the world they had never heard of before. Chapter 534, Supreme Authority. The attack in the Philippines had largely gone unnoticed by the world at large. But those who played their hands at geopolitics and grand strategy had noticed it was a major diverging point in world affairs. Generally speaking, there were two ways the public would respond to the kind of violence that the United States garrison in Manila had enacted upon the rural village outside the city center. And it depended entirely on whether the violence was committed as a reaction, in the heat of the moment, against agitators, terrorists, revolutionaries, or rioters, or whether it was done afterward, as an act of brutal retaliation. If, for example, a group of armed officers opened fire on rioters throwing bricks, Molotov cocktails, improvised explosives, and even engaging in gunfire themselves, then most of the country wouldn't care. Some might even find it comedic in a cosmic sort of way. Only the most radical of citizens would take the agitators' side, and those were already the types likely to join the revolution in the first place. In such a case, whatever civil strife was caused could usually be contained, provided the government forces were willing to commit fully to the violence from that point on and were halfway competent at their jobs. The opposite scenario, however, occurred when violence was committed as retaliation, indiscriminate and brutal, against innocent people, either wholly unassociated with or only loosely connected to the agitators. Even if there were real ties discovered later, the media could always conceal the truth and frame the victims as martyrs, turning the hammer of the state into the villain of the narrative. The media was seldom on the side of the people, or the state, for that matter. It was always on the side of itself and its own interests. If they weren't exactly pleased with the powers that be and had the freedom to publish as they pleased, they would twist, distort, and mutilate the story into whatever form best suited their agenda. Bruno knew this, and he knew that the situation in the Philippines had now crossed that line. There was little doubt that the local media would frame the event as government-sponsored slaughter of civilians. That narrative would fester like a rot, and now the United States, or more specifically its forces in the South Pacific, would have to suffer the wrath of their own stupidity. Sitting across from Bruno were two of his family members. Both had traveled to the General Staff headquarters to continue their political education. Eva, now the Princess of Tyrol and the princess consort to the Prince of Prussia, sat across from her father. She acted like a senior student, here to observe and evaluate the lesson being taught to her nephew, Eric, who was still too young to fight wars of his own but was already learning how to win them. Bruno had not voiced his opinion on the situation. Instead, he had tasked his students with preparing an analysis of the fallout. Eric was to speak first. He stared at the dossier in front of him, eyes moving between troop reports and a map of the South Pacific, while his aunt and grandfather drank beer in silence, watching his every movement. When he finally spoke, both were surprised. "I think the fallout will be most severe when the American public learns what their government has done. For a country that espouses liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, murdering innocent people in a land they occupy because those people are doing the same thing their own founding fathers once did. That's hypocrisy, isn't it? Bruno cast a glance toward his daughter that silently asked, "Do you want to tell him, or should I?" Eva merely raised an eyebrow, clearly volunteering her father for the task. Bruno set down his beer stein with a faint thud, sat upright, and gestured to the map, specifically toward the continental United States. The American people don't give a damn about the Philippines. Eric opened his mouth to protest, but Bruno raised a hand to silence him. The American people believe whatever the media tells them to believe. Let me ask you something. Do you really think that a population enduring an economic collapse gives a single thought to people they've never met, in a country they can't pronounce and will never visit? Eric paused, unsure of how to answer. Bruno didn't wait for one. No one truly cares. Not in any meaningful way. And if someone says they do, they're lying. They're using that false empathy either as a mask to hide their true motives, or worse, as a cudgel of shame, a weapon to make you submit. A heavy pause. Then Bruno's tone hardened. People will say anything to get what they want. If you want to know what someone actually believes, ignore what they say. Focus only on how they behave. Understand why they act the way they do, and you'll know how to control them. Eric let those words settle. He stared down at the map again. After a long silence, he finally nodded, understanding dawning on his young face. You're saying that, without understanding the Americans' behavior, or what drives it, it was foolish of me to try to predict their next move. Bruno didn't reply. He simply moved a carved figurine, a submarine, closer to the American coastline. His voice, now calm, invoked the past, present, and future in a single breath. Know your enemy, and know yourself, and you need not fear 100 battles. Then he smiled faintly and twisted the old proverb into something far more dangerous. But when you understand mankind itself, its nature, its fears, and its appetites, you no longer fight for supreme victory. You rise above it. You play for something far greater, supreme authority. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting firmly on his grandson. And that, Eric, is the game we play in this family. Eric sat in silence, the weight of realization settling over him for the first time in his young life. This was his family, the shadows behind the throne, the unseen hand that guided emperors and shaped the course of nations. They were not merely rulers, but the playwrights of mankind's fable. And his grandfather had built it all in a single generation. Chapter 535, Vengeance for the Fallen. The sun was already low in the sky by the time Lukban's boots touched Philippine soil again. He and his men had returned in silence, spirits lifted by the agreement they had made in Japan. From their perspective, they had coerced the Japanese into signing a deal that was favorable towards them. The vague language used granted them an excuse to renege on the deal after the Americans had been driven from their shores. If the Japanese wanted to use this agreement as a way to incorporate the Philippines into their domain, they had another thing coming. The ferry they had used to land was unmarked, one of many ghost ships making their quiet runs in and out of the archipelago under cover of night. Japanese cargo sat buried beneath crates of dried rice, bundled fish, and rotting fruit, tools of war smuggled in under the guise of peasant commerce. Lukban had thought his mind would be occupied with the consequences of that handshake, of how the Japanese would react when they realized they had been hoodwinked. But his thoughts were interrupted prematurely by a young courier who was waiting for them in the jungle clearing where their trucks were hidden. Barefoot, shaking, his trousers stained with sweat and blood, the boy could barely form words as he thrust a crumpled telegram into Lukban's hand. The others gathered around as their commander opened it beneath the orange haze of a kerosene lamp. The message was brief. The village is gone. Everyone. No coordinates. No signature. No need for either. Lukban's lips moved silently, mouthing the names of the women and old men who had stayed behind. The children. The wives of fighters. The old widow who had once hid his rifle beneath her floorboards and offered him a bowl of sinigang with trembling hands. All of them gone. His silence told the others all they needed to know. One of his lieutenants, Tomas, cursed and kicked over a jerrycan. Another, quieter soul named Silvestra, simply sat down and lit a cigarette, his hands trembling so badly the flame nearly caught his shirt. They shelled it, Tomas finally asked. Lupin nodded once. Artillery, followed by a sweep. Retaliation? Of course. Silvestre took a long drag of his cigarette. So, we're not insurgents anymore. Lupin didn't answer. Instead, he folded the telegram and tucked it into his breast pocket. Then he turned and walked toward the nearest truck. Where are we going? One of the others called after him. Lupin didn't look back to see what's left. The ride took 6 hours. It should have taken less, but the mountain roads had flooded during the last storm, and they had to navigate the wreckage of a broken bridge. By the time they reached the outskirts of the village, dawn was beginning to break across the rice paddies. They stopped a kilometer out. No one spoke. The smoke was still rising. Lupin dismounted first, his boots crunching on cinders and scorched gravel. The others followed slowly, stepping over splinters of bamboo and half-buried pieces of clay pots. Here and there, the smell of burnt meat still clung to the earth, mingling with the iron tang of dried blood. The village was silent. Not a single dog barked. Not a single rooster crowed. At the edge of the wreckage, Lupin knelt beside what had once been a home. He reached out and picked up a half-melted pair of glasses from the dirt, then looked away as Tomas cursed behind him and kicked at the blackened skeleton of a hut. They found no survivors. Only corpses buried shallowly where the blast waves had flung them, some in pieces, others simply burned where they stood. No weapons, no soldiers, no fighters. Nothing here but ghosts, Silvestre said. Lupin stood slowly. His face was calm, but his hands were shaking. No, he said. There is something here. He pointed to the remnants of the well, cracked open by a shell, still steaming slightly in the dawn light. This place was a symbol. They wanted to erase it. Tomas spat on the ground. Then we give them a new one. Lupin nodded, but it wasn't a yearning for justice that burned behind his eyes. It was something deeper, older. The cold, calculating hatred of a man who no longer fought for victory, but for retribution written in blood and carved into memory. They want the world to forget us, he said, to reduce us to shadows, whispers, numbers in a report. They want to bomb away our names. The men around him said nothing. They waited. Lupin slowly stepped onto the blackened foundation of the old church at the center of the village. His voice rose, not in anger, but in solemn finality. Then let them hear us. Let them know our names. Let them hear the truth in gunfire and feel it in every knife between their ribs. We are Anakin Sillingen, not ghosts, sons of the East, and we will make this land bleed with the memory of its people. He paused. Burn their rail lines. Strike their garrisons. Poison their wells. Do not die clean deaths in empty fields. Kill them in the cities, in the roads, in the silence of their guarded halls. Make their children weep the way ours have. It was Tomas who raised his rifle first. To the dead. To the dead, the others echoed. Lupin looked east, toward the rising sun, and to the living who will never forget them. That night, a U.S. convoy was ambushed on the road to San Pablo. A fuel truck went up first, engulfing 3 armored cars in a wall of fire. The screams of the dying echoed off the jungle for miles. The survivors tried to regroup, but before they could rally, they were cut down by accurate, disciplined rifle fire from an unseen ridge. One soldier, crawling for cover, tripped a wire. The resulting explosion threw half his squad into the tree line. Only 2 Americans escaped, and not for long. One died of his wounds on the trail. The other was found 2 days later, strung up from a tree by his ankles, with a note carved into his chest. For every village you burn, we will raise 10 of yours in flame. The message was signed with 3 words scorched into the bark beneath him, in a script both unmistakable and terrifying in its resurgence. Anakin Sillingen. Chapter 536. Ghosts on the Rivers. As Germany's technological capabilities improved with each passing year, so too did the training and doctrine it began to implement. New ideas for warfare, and the machines behind them, were first field-tested with the Werewolf Group, whose numbers had by now grown into a full-fledged division. Currently, along an unnamed jungle river deep in the Philippine interior, German mercenaries sat silently beneath the deck of a patrol craft. Although, To call this vessel a mere patrol boat was a misnomer. In reality, it was an experimental fast attack landing craft. 17 meters in length, constructed from advanced composite materials, it boasted armor capable of deflecting small arms fire while remaining light enough to skim across the water at speeds exceeding 40 knots. It was a weapon designed specifically for coastal and riverine asymmetric warfare. Its very existence was inspired by the longships of ancient Norse raiders, engineered from conception for speed, for terror, and for disappearing without a trace. The same way the Vikings had struck fear into the hearts of greater armies 1,000 years prior. The men aboard were no different, trained in land, sea, and airborne operations. They were the sharpened edge of a new kind of warfare. A template for the future, unleashed early in the year 1930. For now, however, they sat in one of two staging areas, waiting. Above them, the sudden burst of automatic gunfire shattered the silence. The unit's radio operator quickly tuned to the local frequency, head cocked, brow furrowed. Moments later, he sighed in relief. It's just a USAC recon plane. Flak gun up top took it out. From the sound of it, the pilot managed to transmit a burst before going down, but I doubt he saw much. With our camouflage netting and the paint job on this thing, he probably didn't even know we were here before he got blown out of the sky. The unit's sergeant narrowed his eyes, processing the implications. This far out, USAC running recon? That's not right. Something's changed. Our intel might be obsolete. He turned to leave. I'm going up top. I want to know what the hell is going on out there. The boat's crew was already on the radio, speaking anxiously with high command. But their tension wasn't just about the plane. From the chatter, it sounded like a full-scale battle was taking place nearby, exactly where there wasn't supposed to be one. This was meant to be a quiet mission, a precision strike, sabotage work. The target was a reinforced railway bridge, a crucial artery for American logistics. Nothing glorious, nothing that would make it onto a propaganda poster. But it was vital. Now it seemed something had gone terribly wrong. What the hell is going on out there? The sergeant demanded as he stepped onto the bridge. One of the sailors gestured him over and relayed the update. U.S. troops are engaging annexing Sillingen in a village near the target. Our orders stand. We drop you, you plant the charges, you exfil to the FOB. No delays. The NCO growled but nodded. He ducked back below deck, where the mercenaries waited in tense silence. Change of plans. The Yanks are distracted with the locals. That's our opening. The werewolf riverine raiders made landfall under cover of chaos. The Americans, distracted by the insurgents, never noticed the black-hulled craft glide into the riverbed. As the landing ramp dropped, the soldiers poured out, weapons raised. Their STG-25K carbines, fitted with 12.5-inch barrels, quick detachable suppressors, and retractable stocks, made exiting the tight landing bay seamless. They fanned out quickly, moving like wraiths through the reeds. Keeping low, they scaled the slope toward the bridge, pressing themselves against the cold stone supports as a convoy rumbled overhead. Trucks filled with infantry thundered across, no doubt headed to reinforce their comrades at the burning village. The Germans waited in absolute stillness until the last truck passed, then moved swiftly. Plastic demolition charges, experimental high-yield bricks wrapped in wax paper, were affixed to each structural joint of the bridge. They worked methodically, without a word. Each man knew his role, knew the price of failure. Once the last charge was laid, they slipped back to the waiting boat. Inside, the NCO pulled a wireless transceiver from his pouch. A crude, compact unit. I really hope this thing fucking works. He muttered, thumb hovering. Then click. The bridge vanished behind them in a blinding cascade of fire and stone. A roar like a thunderclap rolled across the jungle as the explosives triggered in sequence, reducing the span, and the railway atop it, to a twisted, flaming wreck. The river choked on the debris. Flow disrupted. Mission complete. The sergeant exhaled slowly and crossed himself. He hadn't expected such a perfect detonation. But there it was, textbook annihilation. Strategically devastating and utterly deniable. Already the landing craft was reversing course, cutting through the river at full speed. By the time American forces arrived to investigate, the jungle was quiet once more. No bodies, no tire tracks, no signs of the raiders who'd brought down the bridge. And it wouldn't be the last time. Because by the time the sun rose again over the Pacific, similar strikes had already begun, on other rivers, on other bridges. The werewolves had come to the islands, and they weren't leaving anytime soon. Rumors would begin to spread among the soldiers of the United States that there were ghosts or demons living within the river mists, especially during the dead of night. They were the kind of horror stories that would transcend a single generation and inspire an entire genre of fiction in the future. In the following days, as these tales spread from unit to unit, the cohesion of American morale would be severely affected, with soldiers entering a state of paranoia and terror as they entered rural regions to begin sweeps for Sillingen revolutionaries. Chapter 537: The Future King of France. The Russian army had pushed beyond the boundaries of Pyongyang. After liberating the city, they left behind reserve units to occupy and stabilize it. Logistics flowed in like lifeblood, food, medicine, and water handed out to civilians as if in the throes of a fire sale. The frontline units that had seized the city were rotated out, given a brief reprieve after a brutal campaign. Meanwhile, the Russian Air Force surged forward, clashing in the skies above the port city of Onjin. Bf-109s ripped through waves of Japanese Ki-21 bombers and Ki-27 fighters. Airborne troops followed, parachuting down amid the shattered clouds of war. Japanese soldiers on the ground fought with resolve and ferocity, but the Russian onslaught, like a steel tide under a sky of fire, proved overwhelming. The Imperial Japanese Army and its air service simply could not match the combination of superior equipment and doctrine employed by the Russian war machine. Back in Tokyo, it became increasingly clear the Japanese had grossly overestimated the strength of their modern arsenal. And they were not alone in their miscalculation. Around the globe, observers watched with growing unease as Germany and Russia executed perfectly synchronized theaters of war. Germany annihilating Japanese forces in the Bismarck Sea, while Russia carved a path through the Korean peninsula. It was not merely victory. It was a masterclass in joint warfare. Suddenly, the balance of global power tilted. In London, in Washington, in what remained of independent France, the message was understood: adapt or die. Thus, an emergency summit was called in Washington, D.C., bringing together the President of the United States, the British Prime Minister, and a man thought by Pétain's Fourth Republic to be a mere ghost. France had never fully recovered from its collapse after the Great War. Crippled by civil war and stripped of a generation, it limped forward under Marshal Pétain, a figure propped up by Berlin, cloaked in sovereignty but ruled in truth by the Kaiserreich. On paper, the Fourth Republic was a democratic nation. In reality, it was a military dictatorship under German supervision. But across those long years of quiet oppression, one man had built a movement: Charles de Gaulle. His Réveil de France was ready to rise, if given the tools to strike. All they needed was a moment, and that moment had come. Seated in the Oval Office, de Gaulle lit a cigarette. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence hang, then spoke. "My army is ready. We have a time and location where Pétain and his cronies will be gathered. We can take them out or force a surrender. Either way, France will no longer serve the Kaiser. What I require now is your assurance that when we move, Germany will not retaliate. Do I have it?" The President and the British Prime Minister exchanged glances, then nodded solemnly. "If you succeed, you'll have our full support," the President replied. "If you fail, we will pretend we've never heard your name. I trust you understand." De Gaulle gave no answer. His silence was consent. The men shook hands in grim understanding, unaware that their entire conversation had been intercepted by German military intelligence. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of Berlin, Bruno read the memo on his desk and smirked. So, they finally make their move. I was beginning to think they'd lost their nerve. He set the paper down, reached for his phone, and issued a command. "Begin Operation Silver Crown immediately. And if that pompous old bastard tries to protest, remind him he's still in my debt." That should silence him. He hung up, rising from his desk to gaze out across Berlin's skyline. A thought stirred in his mind, a whisper, but sharp as steel. So the road to war reveals itself. I believe the time has come to curry favor with the House of Bourbon, or what remains of it. A few days later, a letter arrived at the private residence of Henri d'Orléans, Count of Paris. By 1930, he was widely regarded as the most legitimate claimant to the long-defunct throne of France. During the Civil War, he had fled to Brazil to avoid the fate of his distant ancestor, whose head met the blade in another age of revolution. He found refuge among the House of Orleans-Braganza, the former imperial line of Brazil, where he forged lasting ties with his kin across the Atlantic. After the dust settled, Henri returned to France, wary but watching. He was currently enjoying a nice cup of coffee, brewed by one of the few servants he could still afford. Both a caretaker and a companion, she handed a letter to him. The look on her face was one of concern as she recognized the proud symbol on its wax seal. A crowned lion rampant regardant, stepping upon a skull with crossed bones. It was a new coat of arms, one that defied traditional heraldic principles in subtle ways. But there were few in positions of power who did not understand what it meant and who it belonged to. The words caught in her throat, at first, causing a brief stutter as she informed her master of what had arrived. Sir, you have received a letter. It looks important. Henri thought nothing of it at first, though he knew his maid was acting strange. It didn't seem to quite register the gravity of the situation. That is until he snatched it from its hands and turned the envelope over to reveal its seal. Its sender? A name that caused his breath to catch in his throat, Bruno von Zehntner. His hands trembled as he broke the way seal and pulled the letter out, reading its opening lines with trepidation in his eyes. It was simple, yet incendiary. To the future king of France. Henri froze, glancing over his shoulder. Once, twice, thrice. Then he continued reading. Within was an invitation to Tyrol, to meet the man whom diplomats whispered of in corridors and back rooms, the man known across Europe only as the Kingmaker. Chapter 538, The Future of Aviation. The war with Japan continued to rage across multiple fronts. And while Bruno had intended to remain in Berlin for its duration, the escalating crisis in France, and the coup that loomed, demanded his personal attention. The Kaiser granted him leave to return to Tyrol, to his family, and to begin arranging his next political stroke. Bruno arrived at the Berlin airfield in full dress uniform, greatcoat billowing behind him in the breeze. The Reich had recently updated its ceremonial regalia. His new uniform mirrored the crisp cut of the M35 Waffenrock from his past life. But this time, it bore the symbols of the Kaiserreich, not the twisted banners of a regime that would never exist in this world. Thanks to Bruno's hand reshaping the flow of history. His greatcoat was trimmed in black mink along the upper collar, a sharp contrast to the polished leather of his boots, belt, and visor cap. As he strode toward the waiting aircraft, he offered a salute to the escort pilots, two of Germany's finest, each seated in one of the newly unveiled Focke-Wulf PTL-1 advanced turboprop fighters. As for Bruno's own aircraft, it was the second Messerschmitt P.1108/I bomber to ever roll off the line. The first had gone to the Kaiser as his personal flagship. The second had been reserved for Bruno by unanimous understanding. He stopped for a moment, gazing up at the monstrous craft. It had once been little more than a paper design in his past life. But now, fully realized, it soared on engines that rivaled the Soviet Tu-95 in power and efficiency, years ahead of its time. A multi-role Titan, the Fern bomber could function as a strategic airlift, a globe-spanning bomber, or, in future variants, a flying refueling station. With the PTL escort fighters supporting it, there would soon be nowhere on Earth beyond its reach. But today, it would simply take him home. Bruno climbed aboard and entered the lavish interior, not a troop transport, but a palace in the sky. Polished wood panels, velvet-lined booths, and gold accents adorned the cabin. It was fitted for long-range diplomacy, not warfare. A steward offered him a glass of 25-year-old single-malt scotch, aged its final years in a sherry cask. As the engines roared to life and the cabin gently hummed with power, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "All clear for takeoff, sir. Please fasten your seatbelt." Bruno shifted to a proper seat, clipped the belt across his waist, and relaxed as the Fern bomber lifted off the tarmac with unnatural grace. It climbed high above Berlin, shrinking the imperial capital beneath the clouds. He gazed out the window, the skyline falling away into soft haze. Memories stirred, of the past life, of wars lost and opportunities squandered. Not this time. When they reached cruising altitude, the pilot's voice returned. Altitude 9144 meters. Estimated flight time 55 minutes to Innsbruck. Sit back and enjoy the ride, sir. Bruno smiled faintly. A pressurized turboprop aircraft capable of crossing continents, flying at 600 kilometers per hour. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the harbinger of a new age. Before he knew it, the aircraft descended toward Tyrol. Less than 90 minutes after departing Berlin, Bruno stepped through the gates of his palace. Heidi, not expecting him, dropped everything and ran to embrace him the moment he appeared. She kissed him deeply, heedless of propriety or surroundings, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. You're back so soon? Is everything all right? Don't tell me you've already won the war. That's not possible. I would have heard. Bruno kissed her back, grounding her with a single touch. Heidi melted into his arms, reassured by the calm presence of the man she loved. Everything's going according to plan, he whispered. I've only returned to settle a diplomatic matter. In 2 weeks, we'll be hosting a guest. An exiled royal. Here? In our home? She asked, lifting an eyebrow. Who's so important you'd go out of your way to offer them such a gesture? He rolled his eyes. She laughed. Everyone knew Bruno was notoriously antisocial, especially toward strangers. But when he gave his answer, her laughter died. The future king of France. The word struck like thunder. Heidi froze. She understood immediately. She alone knew the full weight of Bruno's ambitions, the true scope of the future he had set in motion. France's subjugation was not a matter of revenge, but the final act in a long campaign of restoration. A return to thrones and crowns, to order forged in iron and blood. Heidi nodded solemnly. Then I'll make sure everything is perfect. Nothing will go wrong. The iron sky above Paris was silent, moonless. Only the hiss of steam and the cold screech of steel wheels against the rails broke the stillness at Gare de l'Est. Marshal Philippe Pétain stood stiffly between 2 German officers, his breath frosting in the midnight air. His overcoat hung loosely from his frail frame, the marshal's baton in his hand now more a prop than a symbol of power. This is highly irregular, he muttered. I have not authorized any relocation. Who ordered this? The taller of the 2 Germans did not answer. Instead, he gestured toward the waiting train, a sleek black engine marked only by the sigil of the imperial eagle and the red and black banner of the Kaiserreich. Its windows were opaque, curtains drawn. Behind them, German soldiers stood at intervals along the platform. Not a French uniform in sight. Not a crowd. Not even a shadow of protest. For your safety, Monsieur le Maréchal, the officer finally replied. His accent was clipped, precise. We cannot allow you to remain in Paris. The situation is fluid. Pétain turned to glance back toward the city, his city. But the skyline was shrouded in fog and darkness. Paris offered no comfort now. Am I being exiled? He asked. No, sir, came the reply. We are establishing continuity of governance. You are simply being repositioned. A pair of boots approached from the rear, another soldier, carrying a sealed leather valise. It bore the tricolor and the crest of the French Republic. The officer took it and handed it to Pétain with polite precision. Your emergency documents, presidential seal, ministerial decrees, and the communications line to Berlin. You will remain president of the Fourth Republic, in spirit. Pétain's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the case. He paused on the steps leading into the train. Then he turned, slowly, to face the empty platform. They'll call this a betrayal. The officer gave the faintest shrug. History will call it a transition. The train doors hissed shut behind him. Moments later, the engine groaned till the Reich had not just removed a figurehead. It had cleared the stage. Chapter 539. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. De Gaulle's loyalists within the Fourth Republic's army stormed the rebuilt Palace of Versailles under cover of early morning fog. What remained of the old palace, reconstructed from war-torn ruins during the fragile peace, was still a symbol, not of monarchy, but of French authority. And now, it was being seized. To de Gaulle's surprise, Pétain's own personal guard offered no resistance. They stood aside silently as the rebels entered. Whether out of fear, disillusionment, or tacit approval, they yielded. The marble corridors echoed with boots and whispered tension until they reached the president's office. De Gaulle raised a fist, then lowered it. His men burst in. He stepped forward into the high-ceilinged chamber, where the tall-backed leather chair behind the desk faced the wide windows overlooking the gardens. A cold grin touched de Gaulle's face. You may have outmaneuvered me in Paris all those years ago. I underestimated how many bodies you were willing to stack just to hold the city. But it ends here, Marshal. You're under arrest for treason against the Republic and the people of France. Silence. De Gaulle gave a nod. Two soldiers advanced, rounding the desk and froze. It was not Pétain who sat slumped in the chair, but Maxime Weygand, head lolled to one side, eyes open and lifeless. A clean hole was punched through his temple. Blood had congealed against the high leather headrest. De Gaulle's blood ran cold. He spun toward his men, barking, "Seal the palace. Find that bastard. He's gone to ground." He knew. The soldiers scattered. De Gaulle stepped forward and stared at Weygand. There was no sorrow, no prayer, no honor for the dead, only contempt. So, the collaborator had gambled and lost. But there was something else. On the floor near the desk lay a single item. De Gaulle picked it up carefully, a faded Great War propaganda leaflet, once circulated by the Americans to deter intervention. On it was the twisted image of a German field marshal marching through gas-slicked trenches, his face replaced with a skull. Green vapor wafted behind him, curling over the corpses of French soldiers. At his side, German stormtroopers with gas masks and bayonets stood as specters. Painted on their masks were grinning skulls. A ghost battalion walking through slaughter. A Latin phrase had been scrawled across the top, fresh and crude, written in what could only be blood. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. De Gaulle translated it in a murmur, almost to himself. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. A bitter, mocking twist of ancient honor. His eyes narrowed, then widened. The hairs on his neck rose. He looked up toward the bell tower above the courtyard. Crack. The shot echoed like thunder. Pain burst through his shoulder, and a chunk of shattered bone ricocheted into the neck of a nearby soldier, who collapsed choking on blood. De Gaulle hit the ground hard, gasping, clutching his wound. Sniper. Find him. Now. But the assassin was already gone. No second shot. No flash. No trace. Medics rushed in. The wound was bad, but not fatal. De Gaulle would live. Berlin, hours later. Bruno stood alone in his study as the report was read to him. The sniper had failed. De Gaulle survived. He said nothing at first, only nodded once, slowly. So be it. Had the shot killed him, it might have changed everything. No war with France. No future bloodshed. But now the Frenchmen would be cautious, and a second attempt would invite scrutiny that Germany could not afford. Bruno turned to his desk. There lay his old Iron Division Pathfinder knife. The blade was pristine, save for one detail, a Latin inscription etched in gold. He picked it up, and with the solemn calm of a man who had weighed every possible cost, whispered, Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. He slid the knife back into its sheath and poured himself a drink. After what had just occurred, there was nothing else that could take the edge off the back of his mind at this moment. Somewhere outside Geneva, armored diplomatic train, en route to Berlin. The rhythmic thrum of the rails was a strange kind of lullaby. It shouldn't have been comforting, yet to Marshal Philippe Pétain, it was. He had not slept the night before, not truly. Instead, he sat now in a leather-upholstered bench beside a narrow window, one gloved hand resting on the walking stick between his knees, the other clutching a glass of wine that he had not touched. Outside, snow traced the jagged ridges of the Alps. Switzerland had let the train pass without inspection. Word was already spreading of the incident in Versailles. He knew what they would call it soon, a coup. A soft knock on the compartment door interrupted his thoughts. One of the German attaches entered, young, clean-shaven, and clearly uncomfortable in the marshal's presence. He handed over a sealed envelope with a clipped bow. From Berlin, Field Marshal von Zehntner sends his regards and confirms your safe passage. Pétain took the envelope, but did not open it. The man remained standing, fidgeting slightly. He cleared his throat. The radio has reported that General Weygand was found dead. Execution style. And de Gaulle? Well, He survived an assassination attempt. He's been hospitalized. There it was. Pétain nodded slowly. Thank you. That will be all. The young officer saluted and exited with relief. Pétain let the silence return. So, Weygand had made his choice. Perhaps he believed in de Gaulle's fantasy of resurrection, of a new France unshackled from German dominion. Or perhaps he simply envied what little power Pétain had left. Whatever the reason, the fool was dead now. He opened the envelope finally. Inside was a short note, penned in a steady, confident hand. France must not fall into the hands of children. We will keep it safe for them until they learn the weight of it. B. Pétain allowed himself a faint smirk. The Germans had never spoken to him with such bluntness before Bruno von Zehntner came along. That man, he was not a soldier in the old sense. He was a builder, a strategist of empires. Pétain had once believed himself to be the savior of France. With the failures of the Third Republic and the chaos that ensued after their surrender to the Reich, he had taken up cause to reunite a bloodied and broken mess. But even now, de Gaulle would rather return to that fractured, festering, humiliated shadow of a nation, if he could be the ruler of its ashes. No, after all he had done, Pétain knew now he could not save it, nor could he hold it. He had done what any old soldier would do when the tide turned. He retreated. Pétain leaned back and shut his eyes. The train rocked gently beneath him, the armor plating groaning slightly as it passed through a tunnel. Let de Gaulle have Paris. Let him raise his little banners and shout of liberty. Let him believe he'd seized power. Because, in truth, the war for France was only beginning. And when the time came to choose between blood and sovereignty, between nation and ego, Pétain knew that the world would not ask who ruled the Palais Bourbon. They would ask who ruled the sky, and the trains, and the flow of steel and coal and bread. He took a breath, deep and cold. Berlin would give him shelter. But France? France would remember. Chapter 540, A Meeting with the Count of Paris. Henri d'Orléans stood at the doors of Bruno's palace, jaw agape, as he witnessed its grandeur. It was a behemoth of neo-Baroque architecture, mixed with futuristic technology. Its scale was easily on par with Versailles, or perhaps even bigger. Bruno did have a tendency to be petty when it came to matters of the French, and the idea that Versailles was debatably the largest palace in the world rubbed him the wrong way. Since he had decided to construct this monstrosity for the sake of his family and future generations, he ensured that he broke the record without dispute. Even so, Henri did not remain slack-jawed for long. Instead, he was greeted by the staff at Bruno's home, who invited the man indoors. And there he saw Bruno and his family, larger than he ever expected it to be. Bruno and Heidi had 8 children of their own, 4 boys and 4 girls, and among them, half were now married with their own kids. Their spouses and children were equally present and dressed in exceptional formal wear. Bruno himself wore his military dress uniform, the medals won in wars past adorned across his body, glistening under the light of the chandelier provided to the palace via the Tesla resonance tower embedded in its tallest spire. In fact, the palace in Innsbruck had multiple redundant power systems, whether in the form of solar panels on its roofing that blended seamlessly with its aesthetic. Savonius wind turbines mounted on the hills above the palace grounds, its power cables routed through fortified structures beneath the earth, or simply the geothermal micro-generator embedded in the lowest level of the bunker complex below the surface of the palace grounds. Bruno's palace was built to survive the end of the world, but Henri did not know these things. Instead, his eyes were captivating by the opulence on display. I must say, Your Highness, this is, as much as it pains me to admit, this is grander than Versailles. Bruno, not being able to conceal his contempt, could not help but make a joke on the matter. Yeah, well, Versailles is now a ruin, so I would hope my home is more suitable than it. Henri wanted to frown at the remark, but Heidi beat him to it, nudging Bruno in the ribs with a disapproving gaze, as Bruno recovered his sense of hospitality and provided introductions. He went on for quite a while, personally ensuring that Henri met and shook hands with each of his family members, and in the end, Bruno invited the man up to his office, where once it was closed, he offered him a drink. I have whiskey, wine, and beer. Pick your choice. Henri, ever the Frenchman, was quick to choose the obvious. A glass of wine would be nice. Having mistaken what Bruno considered was the only acceptable form of wine, Bruno cracked out 2 crystal glasses and poured a cup of port for each of them. He was, after all, still working on finishing the King of Portugal's gift, and had yet to put a dent in the palate from Lisbon. Henry's eyes opened wide when the wine hit his tongue, and he realized it was far stronger than he expected it to be. Placing the glass down on the desk, after taking a few courtesy sips, while Bruno eyed him cautiously. In the end, the awkward silence was interrupted solely by Bruno's discretion. "So, I have summoned you all this way. Well, you know why. It was made pretty clear by the way I wrote the address in the letter, no?" Henri, finally having been given an opportunity to speak about this, latched onto it, and was quick to offer his thoughts. "I honestly thought you were joking when I saw what was written. The House of Bourbon was deposed in finality nearly a century ago, and you think the French people will accept another king?" Bruno was silent, at least at first, while he sipped from his wine. He continued to do so while measuring the man sitting across from him. "Yes, I think France will be begging for a king within the next 15 years. I won't lie to you, at the rate things are going, another war will break out. And unfortunately, I will have to teach France a very painful reminder of what happened in 1871 and 1916, this time so that they never forget." A brief pause, as Bruno sipped once more from his glass. "And when I do, France will be in a worse state than it was in its civil war. They will need legitimacy in order to prevent another one of those from occurring. And that will come in the form of the rightful monarch returning from exile and claiming his seat like his ancestors before him." Henri was stunned by this news. Sure, things had not been the most stable in France, especially after the most recent coup. But another war? One far greater and more destructive than the previous one. He could not help but rise in protest. Can such a thing really not be avoided? With all of your wealth and power, can you not prevent the outbreak of another war? Bruno placed his cup down and sat up in his seat. Leaning forward, he pressed his hands together while staring Henri in the eyes. "Please, sit." Almost subconsciously, Henri sat back down, his outburst quelled with a subtle shifting of his head downwards and the sweat on his brow. All the while Bruno continued. The time for that had passed. If de Gaulle could have been eliminated during the midst of his coup, I would have had a chance to press forward with a transition towards long-term stability through your reign. But alas, the fates intervened, and he survived the encounter with Sharon. Now, I am forced to prepare for war." Henri fell silent. For years it had been the dream of his family to return to power and reclaim their lands and titles. But the way Bruno presented it, the only path to achieving this aim was if France was lit ablaze so horrendously that it would require the Bourbons to return in order to save their soul. It was a complicated matter. On the one hand, he wanted to stand up, turn around, and leave, rejecting Bruno's offer. But that wouldn't stop Bruno, and that wouldn't stop de Gaulle from proceeding with this madness. What mattered now, what was his duty, as the rightful heir to the throne, was to ensure that when the world bled and France burned, he was there to sweep away the ashes and rebuild. Because of this, Henri sighed heavily, picking up the drink he had placed down at the start of the conversation and drinking its entire contents in a single forceful swig. "All right, for France and its people, I have no choice but to align myself with you, especially since I know that neither you nor de Gaulle plan to back down from whatever fury has stricken the both of you. I would almost believe that you have been compelled by Lissa into such insanity, but I know better than that." Bruno, having met a man who quoted the mythology of the ancients as much as he did, curled his lips into a playful snicker. "Oh, you know of Lissa? A name usually forgotten by even the most educated of men. You are surprisingly well informed for a Frenchman." Henri did not take offense. His face did not twist and mutate into a scowl, rather the opposite. An eager expression formed on his regal features as he fired back at Bruno, having accepted the man's challenge. "That's rich coming from a German like yourself." The two men laughed as they poured another glass of wine, and the discussion that followed was no longer about war, politics, or the madness that consumed men to wage those two things with the ferocity of savages. Rather, they discussed family, life, and their individual aspirations. At one point, Bruno even took the man on a tour of his house, showing off the many portraits, most of which were painted by his daughter Elsa's hand. By the time Henri bade farewell to Bruno and decided to return to Paris, he had understood the man well enough to know that Bruno was not a man who looked forward to the upcoming war. Rather, while lamenting its necessity, Bruno understood that so long as France stood defiant and Germany stood dominant, there would be another reckoning. One that could only be quelled when one emerged in a victory so overwhelming in its totality that the desire for another conflict faded from the collective consciousness of both realms and their people. And unfortunately for Henri, he understood that France was destined to be on the losing end of this conflict. As patriotic as he might be for his country and its fellow man, he knew by the end of the night de Gaulle would not stand a chance against a man like the Lion of Tyrol. With that in mind, he returned to Paris fully intent to cooperate with Bruno to ensure that in the world that emerged from the ruins of the next war, France would be able to survive. Chapter 541. The Future Heir to the Throne. Bruno took a flight back to Berlin the night after meeting with Henri d'Orléans, and he was not alone on it. His daughter Eva and the woman's family were also sitting aboard the luxury transport. Wilhelm, who had yet to fly aboard his grandfather's newest plane, found the aircraft to be remarkable. As he stared at its ultra-luxurious interior and the large wingspan outside its windows, he looked like a child on Christmas morning. He could not help but give voice to his boyish wonder while Bruno and Eva spoke about more important issues in the background. My God, this is truly exceptional. It's easily twice the size of my father's personal plane. Does my grandfather really have one identical to this? Bruno chuckled when he saw that. Despite the prince being over 30 already and a father in this life, he still had a boyish sense of wonder to him. That's right, this was the second off the assembly line. Naturally, your grandfather got the first. Soon, the Reich will have these stationed across all of its borders, territories, and of course, air bases, both as civilian airliners and as military craft. Having gauged the size of the interior, which included a private quarters with a full-sized bed and a shower, Eva couldn't help but notice the utility of such a craft. You could easily carry more than one Panzer II in here. As for bombs, I shudder at the thought. You've really outdone yourself this time, father. Bruno smiled proudly at his daughter, who was already thinking about the military applications of the aircraft, while her husband, born and raised for an era of peace, was still caught up in its opulence and grandeur as a VIP transport. Indeed, in 5 years, I hope to have 10,000 of them flying in the skies within the Luftstreitkraft craft. Some for strategic airlift, others for bombing, and a few for refueling. Eva nearly choked on her drink when she heard her father's last words, her eyes widening in shock. Refueling? As in midair. Wilhelm only noticed the discussion going on in the background when his wife began to cough. He interrupted with his own curiosity. Refueling? Is that something unusual? Bruno cast his daughter a questioning gaze, silently asking if she wanted to explain. As always, Eva deferred to his expertise with a gesture, and so Bruno responded kindly to the prince. Allow me to put it this way. On a single tank of fuel, this aircraft could reach the United States from Berlin and make a round trip back, assuming it had the drop tanks to match. So, if one of these were outfitted for refueling, our planes could travel anywhere in the world without ever touching the ground. Wilhelm was stunned. Air power that could strike anywhere in the world? That was revolutionary. As far as he knew, Germany was one of the few nations operating an empire-wide network of commercial flights. Russia was the other. But these planes were limited by range and fuel capacity, making multiple stops per flight path common, especially on longer routes. Wilhelm had completely overlooked the strategic potential of the aircraft, but Eva had not. She thoroughly understood what her father had done and was quick to compliment him again. I said it before, and I'll say it again, father. You really outdid yourself this time. Bruno, however, was quick to wave off his daughter's flattery. Nonsense. I merely provided my engineers with a direction. They're the ones who made it possible. I did little more than fund the right men and give them a gentle push. Eva rolled her eyes. Her father's humility was admirable at times, but here and now, when she was offering genuine admiration, the least he could do was accept it in earnest. She was just about to say something when Wilhelm interrupted again. So, this thing must be pretty fast. Then, if it's designed to go around the world, right? Bruno nodded as he drank from the scotch glass the stewardess had handed him. That is correct. Aside from a few other planes using the same engine blueprint, this is the fastest plane currently in our fleet. In fact, I'd say we have about 20 more minutes before we land. Eva wasn't surprised in the slightest that the aircraft's speed was top-notch. But Wilhelm was stunned. He looked at his watch and realized they'd been in the air for just over 30 minutes. And yet, they had less than that left. Bruno, however, shifted the subject from the marvel of engineering and broached a more important one with his son-in-law. So, Wilhelm, your grandfather is getting older. Soon, your father may have to take up his rightful crown, and that will make you the crown prince. Are you ready for that responsibility? The question came with foreknowledge of the world's coming events. Kaiser Wilhelm II would die in 1941 at the age of 82 from a pulmonary embolism. There was little medicine could do to stop it. Even with Bruno's efforts to research anticoagulants ongoing, there was little more than a decade before this occurred. And while he was doing everything in his power to make sure the medicine was in place to potentially save the Kaiser, he was also focused on securing the Reich's future, with or without him. Wilhelm went silent. His pause was long, but he ultimately answered with the fortitude of a man raised in a far fiercer era, especially as his wife grasped his hand for comfort. With all due respect, sir, I'm not a fool. I can hear what my wife and you speak about behind my back. I also understand that I'm not quite ready for the duties demanded of me yet. A short pause and a deep breath. But I'm willing to learn. And luckily for me, I just so happen to have a great teacher by my side. So, while I pray for the continued health of my grandfather, if the need is suddenly thrust upon me, I know I'll be capable of performing the job that fate demands of me. Chapter 542, Island Hopping. Having secured its position in the South Pacific and denied the Japanese fleet a single island, the German colonial forces decided the time had come to push inland. Inspired by the strategy that won the Pacific theater in the Second World War of Bruno's past life, German Marines began preparing for deployment via an island-hopping campaign. The goal was to slowly invade the small islands in the Pacific that Japan had seized over the course of the Great War, eventually creating a bridge straight to the Japanese mainland. All the while, the Russian army fought for control over the Korean peninsula, giving their alliance the means to force Japan into a position where they would inevitably face an invasion of the mainland, and hopefully in the process compelling them to surrender before such a campaign needed being waged. Bruno was now in Berlin, looking over the map that was corrected in the moment by intelligence reports received over the wire from the field. He deployed a small fleet of forces, a few destroyers, one cruiser, but mostly landing craft. Each landing craft was designed to carry combined arms units onto the beaches. There was, of course, one problem with this. The island's coastlines were riddled with barbed wire and tank traps. As a result, Bruno shifted another much smaller series of figures into position ahead of the fleet. The objective is simple. Drop our airborne forces over the islands and send in our raiders via the coastline. Dismantle the fortifications under the cover of darkness and begin waging asymmetric warfare in preparation for the arrival of our primary force. Thoughts? The other generals surrounding Bruno, Heinrich included, gazed upon the man with varying expressions. Heinrich was proud. He understood that Bruno's thinking when it came to warfare had always been revolutionary. As for some of the other generals, they looked at Bruno's plan with suspicion. Airborne forces had existed in Germany since the years following the Great War, but they had been largely experimental. In use, this would be their first real test in a battle of any scale. Still, many of the old guard had been replaced by a younger, more meritocratic generation of leadership following Bruno's ascension to power. And they did not. Among those present was a Grand Admiral who was quick to give Bruno his approval. My sailors will perform their duties without fault. It is now in God's hands. Bruno nodded his head in agreement, and the orders were communicated across the wire. The next step of the German-Japanese war had begun. Japan had not expected an invasion of their small islands in the Pacific. The fortifications were built decades in advance, but there were no spotlights actively trying to gaze into the sky. The darkness concealed the Ju-52 transport planes as they approached their destination. The men inside were dressed in a unique camouflage pattern. It was based upon the M1929 Telomimetico Italian camouflage pattern used by both Italian forces and the Waffen-SS in Bruno's past life. However, the colors used in its palette were updated to include a palette more suitable for tropical environments. They sat in the compartment of the transport plane, their parachutes attached to the bar and ready to drop at a moment's notice. Among them was an old veteran, an Oberstabsfeldwebel. He wore an insignia on his sleeve that a chosen few had earned the right to adorn over the years. And as he smoked his cigarette, one of the younger, fresher faces asked him a question. "Sir, are you a veteran of the Iron Division?" The man didn't say anything. The weathered lines on his face and the hollowed look said it all. And just when the soldiers gazed at him in awe, the youngest volunteers to march into Russia and fight the Bolsheviks in 1905 had been 16 years of age. That meant the man was at least 41 and had served in the German army for over 2 decades of his life. Finally, as the green light lit up, signaling that they were to drop into the zone, he looked at the young men, boys really, and smirked at them. "That would be the signal. I'll see you lads on the ground, and if not, God be with you all." After saying this, the man jumped, his chute deploying as he fell to the ground over the island controlled and occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army. The rest of the men in his unit followed suit seconds later, inspired by the grizzled veteran who led them into battle. A group of rigid-hull inflatable boats pulled up silently to the shores of the island. The men disembarking from atop hit the sand and crawled towards the tank traps and barbed wire lying in front of them. The objective was simple: dismantle the barriers preventing the army from landing and begin an assault further inland via river channels to draw detection from the garrison. The Japanese on watch had no idea who was on their shores. In fact, from the sound of it, they were drunk and playing parlor games while sitting behind their fortifications. The leader of the raider team raised one finger to his lips to silence the soldiers near him while he pulled a pair of wire cutters from his rucksack, cutting apart the barbed wire, while the rest of his men got to work on the tank traps. Marksmen and automatic riflemen hid in the moss and rocks, covered in ghillie-like clothing, aiming their weapons at the fortifications, ready and willing to take out high-priority targets the moment the situation turned hot. Progress continued, and then something happened. Gunshots erupted in the distance, causing the Marines to hit the ground and hide as best as they could behind the sandbar. Shouts in Japanese occurred from within the compound. Confusion and panic spread as they tried to spot the coastline with their spotlights. The Marines had concealed themselves well with the local environment, but sooner or later they would be revealed if they simply sat still and didn't move. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime for the Marines. Gazing at the mossy rocks that the marksmen blended in with, the spotlight lingered for a bit too long, suggesting the enemy soldier behind it had realized something. And when the marksman flicked off his safety and lined up his reticle, preparing for a shot that would reveal them all, the spotlight died, and the Japanese soldiers flooded out the back of their formation, heading further inland. The officer in charge of the operation quickly turned over to his fellow Marines and gave an order to the radio operator. That was close. The Marines all shared a sigh of relief as the commanding officer gave additional orders. "Tell High Command the airborne forces have made contact with the enemy, and we remain undiscovered. We are continuing with our objective and will update them if the situation changes." The radio operator nodded his head and began to do as he was commanded. By the time the dawn rose, a fleet would be on the horizon, and the Japanese would be scrambling to defeat asymmetric airborne forces and raiders, without ever realizing their defenses to prevent an armored landing were dismantled in the dead of night beneath their very watch. Chapter 543: The Proclamation of the Fifth Republic. The air was cold, but it burned with fire. Not the fire of war, but something older, deeper, the fire of righteous fury, the kind that only smoldered in a person long humiliated, long denied their destiny. Nearly a decade had passed since the French Civil War had ended. The streets of France bore scars of both foreign boots and domestic shame. But at long last, they echoed again, not with despair, but with purpose. A crowd gathered at the foot of the Place de la République, stretching from the steps of the broken Assemblée Nationale to the shadowed edge of Notre Dame. Frenchmen from all corners of the fractured nation had come to hear the man whose name had once been a whisper in the corridors of exiles. General Charles de Gaulle stood atop a hastily raised platform, the tricolor fluttering behind him in the cold wind. soldiers of the Gallian militia and Réveil de France, bearing neither royalist lilies nor the insignias of Pétain's collaborationist army, ringed the crowd like silent sentinels. De Gaulle did not smile. He did not raise his hands in pleasantries. He spoke. Citizens of France, sons of Gaul, patriots of a betrayed and broken motherland. The voice was rough, tired, hardened by exile and war, but it carried across the plaza with unnatural clarity. Today, we end a lie. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. De Gaulle continued. For nearly a decade, a charade has worn the crown of France. Marshal Philippe Pétain, once a soldier, now a dog of Berlin, has fled this land like a rat when the weight of his betrayal came due. He called himself a servant of the people. I call him what he is, a coward. Gasps echoed. A few shouted affirmations. More followed. He sold our dignity to the German Empire in exchange for personal safety. He offered up our lands and bowed to the Reich as if we were no longer a sovereign people, but chattel to be handed from one tyrant to another. De Gaulle paused, letting the silence settle like snow. But no more. He raised a hand, and behind him, the veil dropped. A massive banner unfurled, a clean tricolor with a bold numeral stitched in its heart, V. Today, by the will of the French people, by the blood of our martyrs, and by the mandate of history, I proclaim the birth of a new France. The true France. A roar surged through the crowd. We declare the end of the false republic, the regime of cowardice, of betrayal, of compromise. We bury it with the ashes of Versailles, with the filth of Pétain, with the stench of submission. In its place, we raise the standard of the Fifth Republic. Trumpets flared. Artillery boomed from across the Seine. The Eiffel Tower lit up with waves of red, white, and blue. De Gaulle pressed on, his eyes cold with vision. Under this new republic, there will be no more humiliation, no more occupation, no more borders drawn by foreign cowards and palaces across the Channel or the Rhine. France shall be indivisible, sovereign, and proud once more. The crowd surged. Veterans threw their caps into the air. Women wept. Children shouted the name. De Gaulle, de Gaulle. We shall reclaim all that was stolen. Not merely land, but our pride, our legacy, our birthright. The revolution of 1789 lives again in our veins. But this time, we wield not only ideals, but steel. He paused again, and this time his gaze shifted to the cameras broadcasting across the recovering republic. To our allies abroad, know this, France returns not as a beggar, but as a lion. To our enemies, you thought us broken, but we are French. We do not die. We endure. We resist. We return. He stepped down, and silence held for only a breath before the crowd exploded into chants. The Fifth Republic had no formal vote, no parliamentary birth. It was forged, like the first, in fire. The first act of the new republic? The arrest in absentia of Marshal Philippe Pétain for treason. The second? A national day of mourning for the France that had been. And the third? A decree. France will rise again, and the world shall tremble when she does. Thus began the resurgence. Thus began the march. All the while, Henri d'Orléans watched in the crowd, just another citizen, shaking his head with lament. The poor fools, they know not the wrath they conjure for us all. It was a silent sentiment that he was not alone in sharing. Among the cheering crowds and the raised banners of the new republic were many who realized what de Gaulle's words meant. A generation of men had fought, bled, and died in the trenches of the Great War, and those that followed in the Civil War after. But the older generation still remembered the madness of the Third Republic, which refused to kneel, refused to surrender, refused to submit, even when they had to arm school children to defend Paris. A battle never waged, not because it had actually worked in deterring the enemy from attacking, but because the Germans had already advanced beyond such primitive tactics. Instead, they chose to light a ring of fire around the city and threatened to burn it all to ash if the Republic did not yield. Even with the entire history and heritage of their very nation on the line, the politicians who had yet to flee the country let the outskirts burn before finally cooler heads prevailed and the white flag was raised. It was no surprise that having witnessed this, and understanding the fact that the Germans had been in a time of peace to expand and grow stronger, while their nation bled that many among the older generations were far from servant over the proclamation. They knew that the young would drag them into another war they could not win. And when that happened, may God have mercy on them all. May God have mercy on France. Chapter 544. Long Live the Emperor. Tokyo, Japan, Autumn, 1930. The war in Korea had not gone in Japan's favor. The Russians had mobilized 100,000 men at the onset of their invasion. Meanwhile, Japan had only 30,000 soldiers defending the region when war was declared. Those defenders were long dead, replaced piecemeal by reinforcements drawn from the home islands and other colonies, desperately flung into the meat grinder to hold back the advancing Russian steel tide. Worse still, Japan's attempt to strike into the Bismarck Sea had ended in utter catastrophe. Disaster was the understatement of a century. The Germans, despite inferior numbers, had not only held their position, they had annihilated the Japanese fleet and every Marine deployed alongside it. The Emperor, already kept alive past his natural lifespan by foreign medicines, had grown increasingly frail. He had never wanted war with Germany. Yes, he had felt insulted when Bruno refused to kneel before him during a diplomatic visit years ago, but he had known better than to challenge a sleeping giant. Now bedridden, Emperor Taisho summoned a distant member of the imperial family, a woman in her mid to late 30s. She entered the chamber in full ceremonial form, bowing deeply, her forehead pressed to the tatami mat. "You summoned me, Your Highness?" The Emperor coughed, his weak heart struggling to supply his words with breath. In Bruno's past life, Taisho had died at 47. This time, only foreign medicine, mostly German, obtained through third parties, had kept him alive this long. But now, death was at the threshold. He beckoned her closer. The woman approached the bedside. He whispered something in her ear. She gasped. "Your Highness, you misunderstand. He never cared for me that way. It was unrequited. He wouldn't do such a thing for me." But the Emperor's grip tightened weakly around her wrist, his voice a death rattle of conviction. "You are our only hope now. If my generals continue this madness, all that we've built will be lost. He will not stop. Not until he believes we are no longer a threat. Even if you doubt it will work, you must try." His breath hitched, and then stopped. The woman stared in disbelief. "Your Highness? Please, wake up. Somebody help. The Emperor, he's not breathing." Elsewhere in the command center, the generals and admirals of the Japanese Empire looked as though they had aged 10 years in a matter of months. News had arrived. The Germans were launching full-scale amphibious and airborne operations across the South Pacific. The Japanese had focused everything on the Korean front after their initial failures to seize their strategic objectives, and in doing so, left their southern flank exposed. One island had fallen, then another, then a third. The Germans were building a bridge, an island chain of supply lines and forward operating bases that pointed like a blade at the Japanese mainland. Soon, German bombers would have striking distance. Tensions flared. "We need to divert the second and third fleets immediately to the South Pacific. If not, we'll be facing an invasion from Kosan and Okinawa at the same time." A counter-argument snapped back just as fast. "We can't. Those fleets are the only thing holding the Russian line together. Pull them out, and we lose Korea by winter." Insults followed. Slurs. Raised voices. The brass was seconds away from a full-on breakdown, until a voice cut through the room like the thunder of a dragon. "Enough." Silence. "I just received word from the palace. His Majesty, the Emperor, is dead." The room froze. Every man bowed his head. Grief, shock, regret. He had died in the middle of a war none of them were authorized to start. A war they were now losing. But with his death came obligation. Now, they had no choice but to win. Because to lose would be to dishonor the Emperor's memory. And in the Empire of Japan, there was no greater sin. A thick mist clung to the waterfront like a veil of secrecy. The moon was low, pale, and distant, its reflection shimmering in the black water like silver spilled across oil. The docks, usually alive with the shriek of gulls and the shouts of stevedores, were nearly silent now, save for the groan of rope against wood and the lapping of waves against hulls. A lone figure stood at the edge of the pier, cloaked in a dark traveling coat, a wide hood drawn low over her face. Silk gloves concealed her hands. A scarf masked the lower half of her face. Her posture was upright, but the weight of unseen burdens hung from her shoulders. In her gloved hand, she held a silver stopwatch, old, worn smooth by time. She opened it with a soft click, its polished lid revealing not a timepiece, but a locket. On the left side, a faded photograph of a man in uniform, her husband. On the right, two small children, beaming with innocence. Her thumb brushed the faces, trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, breath forming mist in the cold air. "Forgive me for leaving this way." She closed her eyes. The ocean wind tugged at her cloak, as if trying to pull her back to shore, to the life she was abandoning. "You'll wake in the morning and wonder where I've gone. You'll think I've been taken, or worse. But I couldn't stay. Not with what I've been asked to do." She paused, then glanced back over her shoulder at the idling black motorcar behind her. Inside it sat a man in an old servant's coat, white-haired and hunched, watching quietly from the window. Sakura sighed and looked back at the sea. "The Emperor entrusted me with his final hope. Not the army, not the ministers, me. And I don't even know if the man I'm going to see still remembers me at all." Her fingers hesitated before snapping the stopwatch shut with finality. The sound rang louder than she expected in the quiet night. She slid it into the inner pocket of her satchel and drew the cloak tighter around her. She walked back toward the car. The driver, an aging man named Ishida, stepped out and opened the door. "Your Highness, are you certain?" he asked in a low voice. "Ishida-san," she said softly. "You were with me when I was a girl. When my father passed. When I was married. When I gave birth to my first child." He nodded wordlessly, his eyes wet behind thin spectacles. "Then please, be with me now. Just a little longer. Help me carry out His Majesty's will." Ishida swallowed hard, then offered a stiff, formal bow. "Of course, Princess." She stepped past him and up the gangway, the boards creaking under her feet. A small freighter under a Swiss flag waited quietly in the harbor, its crew paid handsomely to ask no questions. Once aboard, she paused at the top of the gangplank and turned her eyes back toward the shore, toward the land she was about to leave behind, toward her family. "This isn't treason," she whispered. "It's duty." The Emperor knew that peace could never come through war. A bell rang. Lines were loosed. The ship groaned and shifted, pulling away from the dock like a ghost ship vanishing into fog. Sakura did not look back again. Chapter 545, A New Order. Frost fell over Kangwon Province as the Imperial Japanese Army dug deep into their fortifications. Their thick woolen cloaks, lined with hair fur, kept them warm during the winter months. The Russian advance had, in many ways, been halted at what was considered the 38th parallel during Bruno's past life. Not because the Japanese had stopped their momentum, but because logistics were king. And this far south, the Imperial Russian Army would not advance beyond its supply lines. They had spent the last few months preparing for an all-out assault on southern Kosan, while the Imperial Japanese Army kept their distance, watching the horizon. Men like those here today spent their days behind concrete bunkers and earthen trench networks. Heavy machine guns, anti-tank rifles, anti-tank mines, and rifle grenade launchers sat across the sandbags, mounted into position in a desperate attempt to stop the Russian armor in its tracks when the push finally came. However, the effectiveness, or lack thereof, that these weapons had been proven throughout the war. Ultimately, it was the anti-tank guns of considerable size, like the 57mm variants, that proved most effective in dealing with Russian armor. Meanwhile, the fortifications were littered with anti-aircraft weaponry, whether they came in the form of smaller automatic cannons or large-bore flak guns. The line of defense had been constructed in a desperate attempt to deny Russian aerial supremacy over the region. There was just one problem with this mentality. The Japanese had pushed everything they had to the front lines, leaving the South Pacific theater vulnerable. Now they were scrambling to move some of the equipment back to defend against the German island-hopping command, which threatened the Japanese mainland. An enlisted soldier, no older than 20, smoked in silence as he watched a logistics officer barking commands, scrambling to relocate all of the previously listed equipment. With the death of the previous emperor, the Empire of Japan entered a state of controlled chaos. Different departments fought for control in the aftermath, and nobody knew whose orders to follow. as they often came from conflicting commanding officers. It was also tiresome. Because of this, the enlisted soldier looked away, not wanting to see what came next. But even as he ignored it, the dispute continued, escalating with each slur cast and each prodding of the chest, until finally, the officer unsheathed his sword and raised it, screaming as he was about to swing the felling blow upon the NCO he was arguing with. That is, until the loud crackle of a gunshot startled every soldier in the area. Some of them dropped behind the sandbags, perhaps thinking a Russian sniper had fired in their vicinity. But when they looked around, they found that the NCO had drawn his pistol and fired it into the logistics officer's skull, smoking a cigarette in one hand as he did so. There was not the slightest trace of emotion on his face as he barked commands to the unit at large. "Nobody touches our guns. Now somebody clean this shit up." There was no malevolence in his words, despite having just shot an officer dead, only fatigue. Had the Empire of Japan and its Imperial Army been in a normal state, this act would have had the NCO lined up in front of a firing squad. But it was never reported up the chain of command, because nobody cared to do so. And even if it had been, with Tokyo currently in disarray over who was in charge of the new order, there were greater priorities than a single dead logistics officer in Kosan. Months had passed by the time Sakura managed to arrive at the ports in the Reich. Considering the active state of war against the Empire of Japan, her diplomatic passport was met with some scrutiny at the port of entry. She was sequestered, and an interpreter was brought in to speak with her. Throughout it all, she remained silent and graceful, not showing the slightest sign of anxiety. Rather, understanding that her journey across the sea and the task she had been granted would likely end in failure. And in all reality, she was unlikely to ever come across Bruno face to face. It took quite some time, what felt like hours, before an officer of the German Reich's Internal Security Bureau entered the private room she was held in and sat in front of her. A cup of coffee was in his hand as he looked over a folder that contained all manner of intelligence about the woman, her identity, her background, and the current state of affairs in the Empire of Japan. Only after he had become acquainted with the situation in its entirety did he finally deign it necessary to speak. Though his words were kind, his tone was anything but. "Princess Sakura, I wish I could say it was an honor to host you in our great country, but unfortunately these are troubled times, and our two nations are at war. Considering we received no advance notice of your arrival, I would appreciate it if you would show some understanding toward our position and not blame us for being thorough in reviewing your case before allowing you entry into our borders." The interpreter who stood by the investigator's side conveyed his words in flawless Japanese. Sakura simply nodded once and spoke curtly. "I understand." Seeing how the woman was being so compliant and not making a substantial fuss, the investigator continued. "From what you've told the border security agents, you have come in an attempt to negotiate an end to the war on behalf of Emperor Yoshihito. However, I'm afraid I must be the bearer of bad news. The Emperor is dead, having passed away sometime near your departure from Tokyo. Naturally, as you'll understand, this makes the situation more suspicious from our perspective." Sakura remained quiet. She could tell by the interpreter's phrasing and tone that he had already figured out she was very much aware of this fact. The investigator continued. "Seeing as how your relative, Crown Prince Hirohito, was killed in the aftermath of the Emperor's death and the disputes among your leadership, I'm assuming you came here seeking asylum as a political refugee. But for the life of me, I can't understand why you didn't express this intent upon reaching our borders, or why you didn't bring your family." While the tone of the investigator was accusatory, implying that his supposed assumption was a trick to get her to reveal her true hand, his expression softened as he saw Sakura's reaction. She had carried the posture of someone in mourning when she arrived, but at the mention of Hirohito's death, shock overcame her face. Denial set in, and she shook her head hysterically. "No, that's not possible. You didn't know? I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to cause you more distress than you've already suffered. But I'm afraid it's true. Yasuhito has been named emperor after the burial of the man they are now calling Taisho." When the reality of the situation finally hit her, Sakura broke into tears. Both the interrogator and interpreter remained silent and solemn, giving her a moment to mourn. Between her sobs, She let something slip that she had been trying her best not to reveal. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I won't be able to fulfill your dying wish." The interrogator, sensing the importance of the statement, handed her a handkerchief. "Dying wish. The Emperor Taisho sent you here for such a reason." With the cat out of the bag, Sakura had no choice but to reveal her full hand. But in truth, she no longer cared. She was too distraught to continue concealing her mission. "Yes, he wanted me to come to Germany and plead with Bruno to end the war in a way that preserved our nation and didn't destroy it. I'm not sure why he tasked me with this, but those were his last words. He never wanted the war to happen. The attack on your vessels was conducted without his knowledge. He feared that with his passing, the generals and admirals who started it would try to fight to the last man, to honor him in their own sick way." The interrogator wrote down her words before clarifying a final point. "When you say Bruno, you mean His Royal Majesty, General Feldmarschall Bruno von Zehntner, the Grand Prince of Tyrol?" Sakura wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes, he's the one. Although when I knew him, he was just a simple colonel in your army. But that was a lifetime ago." A few words were exchanged between the interrogator and his interpreter. Then the investigator closed his notebook, gathered his documents, and stood. "Your Highness, I'll have someone come take care of you while I arrange your transport to Berlin. His Royal Majesty is currently staying there for the war effort and will be alerted to your arrival immediately. I do hope you can find some solace before then, and I apologize for causing you further distress." The interrogator performed a deep, genuine bow before exiting. The interpreter followed. Sakura remained alone in her grief. Chapter 546. Dinner with the Kaiser. Bruno was out at dinner with the Kaiser. The two of them were enjoying a couple of beers and a hearty meal at the Imperial Palace in Berlin. The year had been a rather ragged one for Bruno. He had been spending his time in Berlin, living in the same barracks as the young enlisted men, all while micromanaging the war. Whether it was logistics networks back home or troop movements in the field, he made sure everything was in place. Sleep was rare, and the luxuries he'd once enjoyed while living with his family were long gone. Even so, when meeting with the Kaiser, Bruno ensured he was in proper shape. Whether it was his clean-shaven face, freshly applied cologne, or clean-cut hair, which, now in his early 50s, had begun to show signs of graying, Bruno always presented himself with the utmost decorum. To him, it was a matter of respect and proper courtesy. As for the Kaiser, he looked quite well for his age. He commented on the war as if it were a distant affair, a minor inconvenience to be handled. "So, I've heard that the Japanese lines in Korea will falter within the fortnight, as the Russians have ensured that their winter offensive is ready. If they succeed, how long do you think it will be before the war comes to an end?" Bruno considered it for only a moment, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling before he resumed cutting into his worst. "By next summer at the latest. Although the Japanese appear to already be in a state of infighting. With the deaths of the emperor and the crown prince, chaos reigns. Everyone with ambition is now trying to consolidate power rather than focusing on the war effort." The Kaiser scoffed, shaking his head as he continued eating. "Amateurs." Bruno chuckled and nodded in agreement. He was just about to bring up the ongoing situation in the Philippines and its impact on the United States when an aide rushed into the room and whispered something in his ear. Bruno responded curtly, but politely. "Thank you, Oberst. That will be all for now. I'll let you know when I'm ready to deal with it." He wiped his mouth with his napkin and checked his watch, dismissing the aide with a small gesture. The Kaiser noticed. "Is something the matter?" Bruno reached for his beer stein, took a long drink, and shook his head. "Not at all. I have an unexpected guest. Someone from my past I haven't spoken to in a long time. She's likely here as an agent of the enemy, hoping to manipulate me into negotiating favorable terms for the Japanese. But she means nothing to me. It's a ploy, nothing more. My part in this game can wait until after we've finished our meal." Wilhelm raised a brow but returned his attention to his food. Still, his words cut deep. "So she's like Marie Adelaide, then?" An innocuous comment, but it wounded Bruno more than Wilhelm had intended. Bruno placed his utensils down and raised his voice slightly in defense. "It is nothing like that. I made a mistake with Marie. But with this woman, and all the others, there was never anything to begin with. Just the passing fancy of an enamored teenage girl, affection she kept far too long. From the start, I made it clear I thought of her as little more than a child. You have known me for so long, and still you think so little of me. In all their years of friendship, Bruno had never raised his voice to Wilhelm. And now, in the twilight of the Kaiser's life, he was finally seeing the real man. Wilhelm placed his silverware down, sitting upright to meet Bruno's glare with one of his own. I've known you since you were an adolescent. You remember our first meeting? Of course you do. My daughter's second name day. You started a duel in my home, an illegal act, with that pompous twat. You bloodied him well. The entire court applauded you. Bruno's gaze stayed defiant. You were 15, a mere junker's son, yet you took up a sword against a prince, with no fear of the consequences. And you did it to protect your woman's honor. From that day, I knew you were destined for greatness, and I gave you every opportunity to prove it. You never let me down. Bruno narrowed his eyes. Are we really going to sit here and talk about ancient history? With all due respect, Your Highness, aren't there more important matters to discuss? The Kaiser sighed and took another swig from his stein. Bruno, I've known you for a long time. Don't take offense, but I must tell you, you tend to look at people as either enemy players or pawns on the board. It gives you an unhealthy suspicion toward others, even those who genuinely try to reach you. That's why things with Marie happen the way they did. So why not go speak to this woman and listen to what she has to say, without assuming the world is conspiring against you for once? Bruno scoffed and drained his stein. Standing up, he wiped his mouth with the napkin and tossed it on the table casually. His lack of decorum was noted, but the Kaiser said nothing. Bruno broke the silence. Since when did you become so wise, Wilhelm? Then he left without another word. The Kaiser sat in silence, not angry or offended. A genuine smile spread across his face. For 40 years, I've extended the olive branch of friendship. And that's the first time you've ever called me by my name. A pity you accept it only now, when I am but a dying man in the twilight of his years. Despite his words, Wilhelm's mood was elated throughout the night, as if he had managed to cross one final act off his life's list of ambitions. As for Bruno, he went to confront Sakura and see what she had to say, and why, after all this time, she had returned. Chapter 547, A Past That Never Was. Bruno had left the Kaiser's palace at a moment's notice. His thoughts were heavy, towards the past, the present, and as always the future. But he had little time to dwell on them, at least not now. No, he had to meet with someone from his past, someone he thought he would never see again. And Bruno met Sakura at his old manor in Berlin. The address had been given to her, and she was escorted there by members of the German National Police. The home had long since been abandoned by Eric and his family, who, in recent months, had moved back to the family's primary residence in Tyrol. But it was kept clean and tidy by Bruno's staff, who maintained it daily. Tonight, however, they had gone home, leaving it the perfect place for a quiet, private meeting. When Sakura stepped through the doors, she saw him standing before the fireplace. He had grown older. The lines on his face spoke of war, of loss, of endless burdens. But they weren't harsh, just gently worn. Perhaps, by some strange sorcery, age had only just begun to erode the man's youth and vigor. The gray in his hair gave him a rugged edge, rather than robbing him of his presence. Gone was the charming, princely youth she remembered. Before her stood a hardened figure of history. Bruno was gazing up at the photographs above the mantel, images of himself as a young officer, with his wife and their eldest children in this very house. Eric had kept them, adding photos of his own family with Alia, a legacy carried forward. At first, Sakura said nothing. How could she? It was too surreal. But when Bruno finally turned and looked at her, she broke the silence with nervous small talk, her eyes avoiding his. A lovely home you have here. I never imagined you'd live somewhere like this. Bruno chuckled quietly, shaking his head. I was born into the lowest rung of nobility. This house has been in our family since before we even held a title. Whatever I am now, a prince, a statesman, it came through my own labor. But this place, this is where my first children were born, where my wife and I built the life that we have today. Sakura hesitated. She still couldn't look him in the eyes. But her voice, though quiet, pressed on. She is a lucky woman. Bruno's answer came faster than she expected, and gentler. I'm a lucky man. I don't think I would have survived all these years if I didn't have her and the children to come home to. A pause. But that's not why you're here, is it? To talk about my merit. He sat down, motioning for her to do the same. She followed, settling across from him. So much she wanted to say, but there wasn't enough time, and she knew it. Duty came first. Personal feelings were secondary. I come on behalf of the late Emperor Taisho, she said finally. His dying wish was that I try to secure favorable terms for Japan. Should you emerge victorious? Bruno sighed deeply, the disappointment flickering across his expression. So, duty to the end. Is that all we are? So, when is it anything but? Bruno nodded, slowly. Never. Not for people like us. Our lives were never meant to be free or whimsical. They are what they must be. He straightened. Very well, Princess Sakura. If this is to be a diplomatic visit, forgive me for not standing on pretense. Her heart pounded, but she said nothing. She had chosen this. She had to see it through. Bruno's voice hardened, not cruel, but coldly honest. Give me one reason I should treat your empire fairly. After your fleet attacked ours without provocation. After you dragged us into a war that has taken thousands of lives and drained millions from our coffers. Why? Why should I show mercy? She had no answer. Even though she knew the emperor hadn't started the war, but that didn't change the facts. From Germany's perspective, it was a war of aggression. An unnecessary one. A bloodletting born of ambition. Sakura looked to the floor, tears forming, not from guilt, but from failure. She had come to fulfill her duty, and she had failed. Bruno's next words softened, if only slightly. My mercy is this. After the war ends, Japan will still have a homeland. The Japanese mainland. Okinawa, Sakhalin, a few other islands. But the rest, your colonies, your stolen territories, they will be returned to their rightful owners. Or granted independence. Sakura nodded, voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I understand. Thank you. I expected far less. Bruno stood and led her to the door. Sakura, return to your people. You have my answer for both your questions. He paused. And should your family ever be in danger after this war ends, you may petition Tyrol for asylum. You'll be welcome. Then, gently, he took her hand and kissed it. A gesture neither romantic nor political, but human. He sent her off in the waiting car that would return her to the harbor. She would go back to Japan, not as a diplomat, not as a girl chasing lost love, but as a woman freed from the weight of impossible hopes. And Bruno? He returned to the firelight alone. As always, he thought for a long time that night in silence, not bothering to return to the barracks. Wilhelm's words had struck deeper than he initially thought they had. They left many questions. About himself, about this life, about how he had treated his second chance and those around him in it. And after staring into the light for so long that he practically became it himself, Bruno laughed and shook his head. Wilhelm, you old bastard. Why couldn't you have let these thoughts lose 30 years ago? Chapter 548, The Global War on Terror. Berlin, June 22, 1931. It had been nearly 2 years since Bruno first arrived in Berlin, and the barracks where Bruno was staying had all the facilities a soldier needed to maintain an optimal combat physique. Because of this, Bruno spent the morning running, lifting weights, and training in martial arts against the facility's bags and dummies. After which, he would take a cold shower and have breakfast with a cup of coffee. This had been his life since the war with Japan had begun, and he had only seen his family during infrequent brief visits home. But in the end, he always returned to Berlin. Now that he was in his later years, he was beginning to understand that it was easier when he was young and commonly deploying to foreign battlefields to be away from his family. Despite the fact that his children were younger then, it had simply been a normal part of his life since the moment he graduated from the academy. But over a decade had passed since the Reich found itself embroiled in a conflict, and though Bruno was not actually in the South Pacific fighting anymore, he was still away from home in a way demanded such a lifestyle. Twice over the last year, especially since the introduction of his turboprop-powered transport, Bruno had petitioned the Kaiser for permission to simply fly to Tyrol and back every evening and morning. But the Kaiser wouldn't have it. Sure, the travel time may have been reduced to 50-55 minutes, but if an emergency were to occur, that was an hour that they couldn't afford to wait for. Because of this, Bruno was kept close in Berlin, living what he considered the dullest deployment in the entirety of his military career. Today, like most days, Heinrich passed by Bruno's desk on his way to his own office just 2 doors down and made light of the situation with a mug of coffee in his hands. "You know, I've been meaning to ask. It's been over a year since you came back. How do you enjoy life in Berlin?" Bruno narrowed his eyes at his old friend. His silence was enough to convey his thoughts. And just when Heinrich was about to conjure a witty retort, Bruno sighed. "If I was 10 years younger, I would have told the Kaiser to suck it and forced my way into the South Pacific to personally take charge of the war from the field. I fucking hate this office work. I'm a field commander, not a fucking desk jockey." Heinrich chuckled when he heard this before sitting down in front of Bruno's desk. Evidently, he didn't have much to do either as he looked at one of the folders lying in front of him. "Bag on Katapunin? What the hell is that?" Bruno looked over at the folder and groaned. It was clearly a situation he was trying to put off until after he had his coffee. He leaned back in his chair and instinctively reached towards his coat pocket, searching for a pack of cigarettes. A habit he had kicked over a decade and a half ago. And when he realized what it had done by pure instinct, he sighed once more. The collective term being used for the various revolutionary groups popping up across the Philippines. He let his words deliberately linger, as if to bait Heinrich into interrogation further, perhaps wanting to share his dread with another in a form of petty spitefulness. Whatever his reasons, Heinrich fell straight into the trap head first. Various revolutionary groups. There's multiple now? What happened to Anakin Sillingen? Bruno couldn't help but look at Heinrich, but his gaze was far past the man's figure, as if he was instead visualizing history replay right before his very eyes. Of this life, of the past timeline he had come from. All of it blending into one symphony of bloodshed and violence, as mankind was so prone to do. The same thing that happens to every revolutionary group if it lasts long enough, fractured, divided, multiple subgroups pop up, each with their own ideology and ideas on how to run the world after they have supposedly won the war, all claiming true succession from the original, or perhaps some older legacy still. Heinrich, clearly interested further in the topic, opened the file and began reading, while Bruno summarized its contents to him. "You have the Katapunin Bayan, also known as the KB, or the Civic Front as we would call them. They operate as a legal political party in the American territory of the Philippines. Their ideology is one of general independence and anti-American sentiment." Heinrich looked up at Bruno, seeming to have understood a distinction. "So they're moderates then?" Bruno, however, took a sip from his coffee, his eyes tracking Heinrich's exact facial movements as he did so. In any insurgency, the only difference between a moderate ideologue and an extremist one is the extremist wants to chop off your head, and the moderate wants to watch him do so. On the surface, they disavow the violence, but the reality is they provide logistic, material, and moral support for the other cells fighting for a sovereign and independent Philippines. Heinrich didn't comment on Bruno's words. The man seemed to understand warfare and geopolitics at a near superhuman level of comprehension, and so he took his word for it. "So, then, who are the active players?" Bruno sighed and counted them off the top of his head. "Currently, there's 2, and they hate each other about as much as the Americans. You've got Makabayang Hukbo ng Silingen, aka the MHS, or the Patriotic Army of the East. They're the militant wing of the KB. They're incredibly disciplined and well-armed." Bruno paused to take a sip of his coffee before continuing. "They use old weapons provided by the Japanese. Smuggled into the territory covertly by the Compilation, they focus exclusively on government targets, primarily soldiers, police, and politicians who collaborate with the U.S. government. They're the lesser of 2 evils, and that's saying a lot. Considering the gruesome photos of their covert activities displayed in the intelligence briefing, Heinrich was shocked to hear Bruno's assessment of the MHS. "So, then, who the hell are the greater of 2 evils?" Bruno climbed out of his leather-bound office chair and received a reel of film, which he then quickly shut his office door and pulled down the shades to allow the projector to perform its job. The tape reeled, and Heinrich stared stoically at what it contained. A group of heavily armed men, mostly sporting old weapons from the Great War from a variety of nations. Austro-Hungarian Mamluchers, Russian Mosins, and a few pre-war era German Mauser C96 trench carbines. These weapons had made their way through the black market for years and clearly had seen better days. But what was most notable was the man in the front. He, like the others, wore a blood-red bandana with a black star painted over its center and wielded a locally forged beyond the lookout machete. The blade was held to the neck of a bound and gagged foreign man, one that appeared to be crying. The revolutionaries spoke in Tagalog, which Heinrich didn't understand, but the decapitation that quickly followed translated the words for him. After the film had concluded, Heinrich looked back at Bruno with a stern gaze. Who was that? Bruno, quickly identifying who in particular Heinrich was referring to, stashed away his film equipment and sat back down at his seat. The victim? An American tourist by the name of Tom Richards. He probably didn't even know there was a war going on. As for the men who killed him, they belonged to a group known as Katapunaning Dugo at Leia, and before you ask, it means the Brotherhood of Blood and Freedom. A brief pause. The KDL broke away from the MHS earlier this year when the Civic Front proposed a ceasefire with the Americans. As you can see, their brutality and general disregard for collateral damage, as well as their deliberate targeting of civilians for the sake of spreading fear and panic, has made us consider a new designation for such groups. Heinrich stared at Bruno for several moments, trying his best to process all the information he had just heard. And that is... Bruno did not hesitate. His voice was sifting and stern like the thunder in the midst of a storm. The term I proposed to the Kaiser and the General Staff is terrorist organization. Heinrich took 1 second to think through the term and nodded in approval as he did so. It's catchy, but what's the difference between a terrorist organization and a regular revolutionary group? Bruno smiled upon hearing his friend's question and was quick to enlighten him on the details. The lines are pretty blurred. In pragmatic reality, a terrorist organization is any violent non-state actor acting in the name of politics that we disapprove of. But if you want a definitive definition, it would be one such organization that deliberately targets civilians and other parties not involved in the conflict. And we don't negotiate with terrorists. Those final words sat lingering in the room for some time, stirring the silence that would otherwise have slept quietly. Bruno leaned back in his chair and reflected on the past and the future. He had initially thought that if he changed the timeline, things like this would be prevented from arising. And he had done a wonderful job so far mitigating certain future risks. But unfortunately, he had not prevented the rise of terrorism in the world. It might wear a different face, wave a different banner, and follow a different ideology. But when the people had access to arms to challenge their masters and rage in their hearts over perceived injustices, violence and terrorism were an inevitability. And the industrial age had made this true no matter how much Bruno tried to change the world for the better. So, it begins. The Global War on Terror. Chapter 549, The Last Toast. Tsar's Winter Palace, St. Petersburg, Russia, 1931. Elsa sat by the window, painting the landscape below, and her children playing in its grass. Life had been extremely peaceful and pleasant since her marriage and move to the Russian Empire. Alexei was being groomed to become his father's successor, a failure Nicholas did not intend to replicate from his own upbringing, and the Tsar had even asked Bruno for a list of material that he would recommend. Bruno, having compiled a large curriculum on necessary readings to rule a nation and run a war campaign, all of which was more philosophical and instructive than actually doctrinal-based, had sent the list he used as the material for the education of his own children, as well as the way he handled discussions with them, teaching them how to think, not what to think. Sure, Alexei was now an adult and had begun learning the basis for rulership many years ago. But his father was getting older, much like Wilhelm in Germany, and extending his preparations to become a more suitable future monarch was a necessary step towards the continued prosperity of the Russian Empire and its people. As for Elsa, she didn't play politics, at least not to the extent her elder sister Eva did in Berlin. She was more like her mother in that regard. The peace that her husband needed when he came home from war, and counsels regarding national policy. In her free time, she continued painting masterpieces that would make the likes of Monet and Van Gogh cry with envy. Today, however, an unexpected visitor arrived, or I guess you could say, a host of them. While her children were out playing in the yard, and she was in the midst of completing her latest project, a familiar voice erupted from behind her. Well, if it isn't my dear little sister Elsa. Long time no see. Elsa looked over and saw Eve standing smugly in the doorway, prompting the woman to immediately put her paints aside and walk over to her older sister, staring her in the eyes with an ice-cold facade. "Princess Eva, I was not expecting your encounter. I thought at this hour you would still be nursing your sickness from last night's festivities." Eva glared at her sister sternly, and then the two broke out laughing as they hugged one another. "You little brat. You make it sound like I'm an alcoholic." Elsa smiled as she embraced her older sister. "I missed you." Eva returned the gesture as they stood together in silence for a while. "Me too." The emotional reunion of the two sisters was interrupted by another voice from behind them, joining in on the fun that he had just witnessed a moment before. "What do I see here? A Habsburgian relationship in the Tsar's home? How scandalous." The two sisters broke away from one another in an instant and looked over to who had said that to see their brother standing in the doorway, smirking like a charming devil as he did so. "Erwin, get your mind out of the gutter, you little knave." The man walked over to his two sisters and hugged them both. All the while Elsa was stunned, looking at the two of them, instantly realizing something. "Wait, what are you both doing here?" Eva was about to say something when Erwin interrupted her, swirling the glass of wine in his hands as he did so. "You weren't made aware? The Tsar invited us all out to visit. Father and mother included. They are downstairs now, speaking about something dreadful or another. I don't know how you lot do it. Politics is so dull." Eva grabbed her little brother by the ear and yanked on it hard, but not painfully so. "You little brat. You're our father's heir, and you still have no interest in the family business. I know you're not brain dead enough to have no proper understanding of our family's place in the world, and yet you treat your position like a joke." Erwin, wincing in embarrassment more than pain, in a way he had not suffered since he was bullied by his sisters as a child, was quick to plead for mercy. "Yield. I yield. My beloved sister Eva, please spare me. I am no match for your fury." This only seemed to provoke Eva more as she applied the slightest torsion to the man's lobe. "Fury? I am a lady. Do you think I look furious to you?" Elsa only giggled at the two siblings, remembering their past as youths growing up together. "You two are so immature. If I didn't know better, I would say it was still the year 1910. 1910, 4 years before the Great War, the year the second crop of children their parents had begun to raise were born. It was the last year the three of them had together without any real responsibility, without the threats of war and the stress of managing entire sectors of governance, or being raised how to do so. The twilight of their innocence, that comment alone halted Eva and Erwin in their childish tomfoolery, as they all sat there in silence reminiscing about their youth and the world that once was, but could never be again. Finally, a voice erupted from behind them. "There you are, all three of you. I have been looking all over the place to find my oldest children. What are you all doing up here?" Bruno stood in the doorway, aged but not old, weathered but not wrinkled, his appearance afflicted more by the brutal weave of fate than by the petty cruelty of Kronos. And as he gazed upon his children, each of which still shared the graceful aging of their parents, he couldn't help but smile. "Well, come along then. Your mother is waiting for you all below." Bruno then left the room, giving his kids a moment to finish up whatever moment he had interrupted. And Elsa, the youngest of the three, was the one to step forward, lifting the hems of her dress as she gracefully descended the staircase. "Duty calls." Eva and Erwin were left to stare at one another in silence. Though they exchanged no words, the glances shared between them shared the same sentiment. When does it not? Joseph stood next to his bride Sophie von Hohenberg, the oldest child and sole daughter of the late Archduke Frank Ferdinand. Like his older brother, Joseph had married young. It was a dynastic necessity, considering Sophie was 9 years his senior. Because of this, despite being a mere 21 years old, he was a veteran when it came to being a father and had a small crop of his own children. He gazed upon the ballroom where the house of Romanov and the house of Zehntner had gathered, or at least their main branches. Even Bruno I, Joseph's grandfather, stood proudly in the hall, wearing an old Prussian colonel's uniform from the war 1871 and the medals he earned on its front lines. Bruno's father was ancient by now. He was in his early 90s, and despite his advanced age that was well beyond the norm of the era, he was still walking, albeit with a cane. Death seemed to have lost his patience waiting for the old veteran, and thus Bruno was still not the leading member of his house. Even so, a decree had been made in years past, granting Bruno, the youngest, the line of succession considering his princely status. And hence, Bruno was considered the head of the house in all but name. It was because of this that only Bruno's line was present. As for Nicholas, he seemed to be pleased by the sight of their two families, prosperous, healthy, and plentiful, being gathered together for a summer visit. And when he noticed this, he walked over to Bruno's side and spoke in a hushed tone that only the two of them could properly hear. It seems the future will be in good hands. I see knights, princes, and titans of steel and lead alike gathered here, surrounded by princesses and maidens of virtue. They will be all right without us by their side, won't they? Bruno looked over at Nicholas. The man's gaze was somber. He pieced together what the man was thinking. How bad is it? Nicholas's expression turned grim as he sighed heavily and faced Bruno. The doctors say I have about a year left to live. Even the most advanced treatments for cancer that our scientists have developed have no chance of saving my life. That is why I gathered you all here today. Of course you would detect it immediately. Bruno frowned. He had always kept an arm's length from figures of historical significance in this life, believing them worthy of such respect and courtesy. But Nicholas and Wilhelm had always tried to approach like a genuine friend. He had seldom reciprocated, not until recently, as he began to understand their deaths were soon approaching. And it would appear Nicholas's had come sooner than Bruno had thought. Nicholas, I'm sorry. I know it's too late to say this now, but I should have accepted your offers of friendship much sooner. You have always treated me with dignity, respect, and genuine kindness. And I behaved too formally, as I thought was my duty. I promise you, your son will have my love and my protection, the way I have provided the same for you throughout all these years. Nicholas smiled bitterly. It was not the response he was expecting, and it for sure had come too late in life to the point where it was almost cosmically comical. But in that bitterness was genuine happiness as he placed his hand on Bruno's shoulder in a gentle gesture of acceptance. It's okay, my friend. I go to God now. He paused, glancing toward Bruno Sr., who stood proudly beside the Tsarevich Alexei, regaling the young heir with tales of distant battlefields and an era of gallantry long past. And should death ever finally deem it fit to wrestle with your father, Nicholas said with a faint, wry smile, I'll share a drink with him in paradise. I'll tell him all about the man you became, the man we all leaned on in the end. Bruno was struck silent. Nicholas gently stepped away, his words lingering like the scent of incense after a liturgy. He glanced back once, his voice carrying with a warmth that defied the weight of fate. Come now, Bruno. Don't look so glum. I've lived a good life these past 20-some years, thanks to your friendship. Be happy for me. Death comes for us all, and I intend to meet him without regret. And then, silence. Bruno remained standing long after the Tsar had stepped away to make his final announcement. He neither heard the words nor registered the ripple of shock and sorrow that followed. He simply stared into his glass of wine, as if its depths were endless. Chapter 550, Quartermaster of an Empire. The Tsar's message left a somber atmosphere across the room. He had announced that within a year at the latest he would be dead, and his son would succeed him as Emperor of Russia. It was a monumental statement to his family who hadn't the slightest clue of his condition. And Bruno himself stayed silent for the rest of the gathering. Whatever festivities were had with a brief reunion were thoroughly stifled by the Tsar's speech. And there in the silence, Bruno realized what was happening. He was getting older, and he was witnessing that even titans of history cannot emerge victorious against death itself. Franz Ferdinand had been dead for a decade. Svetozer had lived just long enough to be given a funeral worthy of his service. Hindenburg was on death's list, and so was Kaiser Wilhelm II. In just a decade he would pass. And now Tsar Nicholas II within the year. Men who had forged an era whose legacy Bruno had preserved in a defiant battle against fate itself. And one day, he too would be interred in the ground. Would he be given another life then, like he had the first time of his passing? Would he be welcomed by St. Peter through the pearly gates as a reward for his faith and service to God and fatherland? Or would he face eternal damnation for the blood he had shed in the act of preserving the world as he felt it should have been? When death finally came for him, would he too have such a chipper attitude, like Nicholas appeared to maintain even now, knowing his time was ticking by with each passing second? It was a question he could not answer, no? He could only drink. Drink to numb the pain of having forsaken the chance to personally become close to the men he idolized. Drink to dull the senses so that he might forget what he had learned here today, even for the briefest of moments. And drink so that he would not have the wherewithal to think about it for a second longer. And as he reached for the fourth glass of vodka of the night, Heidi stopped him, grabbed the bottle from his hand, and hugged him tightly. I know it's hard for you right now. It is for all of us, but that bottle is only going to make things worse. Bruno gazed into Heidi's sky-blue eyes, and then down at the liquor which called to him, seducing him to drown himself in its numbness. And then there was nothing. No whispers, no chance, no influence. A sudden sense of sobriety overcame him as he realized what he was about to do, and instead smiled bitterly as he held his wife in his arms tightly. Thank you. Nothing more needed to be said between them, but the sight of not drinking excessively to cope with the news had inspired several others in the room who witnessed the scene and had similar habits of dealing with negative emotions to emulate Bruno's behavior. They put their bottles down and instead chose to not mourn the night, but enjoy the time they had left with Nicholas. Bruno decided that rather than talk about strategy, economics, politics, and vision with the man, that he would take him aside and instead dwell on less important matters. Bruno and Nicholas wandered off to the Tsar's personal office. There they fetched not alcohol, but coffee and salted nuts, an attempt to sober themselves as they spoke in privacy. Nicholas thinking that perhaps Bruno wanted to ask about his future plans and was quick to interrupt. I understand that you might be a bit anxious about this sudden announcement, but with all due respect, Bruno, I would rather keep things lighthearted as can be tonight. So if you will excuse me, I think I will have to pass on a sudden strategic meeting. Bruno, however, stopped the Tsar with his words as the man was reaching for the door behind him. You know, in all the years I have known you, I never asked. Is it really true? Nicholas turned back as his hand touched the handle, his fingers wrapping around the gilded brass knob, as he saw Bruno smirking at him. Is what true? Bruno took a sip from his coffee with a mischievous grin as he asked the question that had been bugging him for years. Come on, Nicholas, don't play coy with me. Tell me about your visit to Japan when you were a young man, and how you managed to police your own personal police escort so much the man tried to kill you. I have heard many theories over the years, but have never been able to discover the truth. Enlighten me. Nicholas simply chuckled and shook his head, looking at Bruno as if he had discovered a new part of the man he had thought he figured out so many years ago. This is what you wish to ask me? I will be dead and buried in a year, and you want to know about what happened in Otsu all those years ago. Bruno chuckled, his voice far softer and less grim than it was before when he first heard of the Tsar's impending doom. Well, yeah, with all due respect, Nicholas, I know so many things about you, but this is one thing I am dying to know. So please, enlighten me. Tsar Nicholas couldn't help but smirk as he stared at Bruno's pleading gaze. What happened in Otsu is between me, George, and our Heavenly Father above. Perhaps when I see you in the next life, I'll tell you then. After saying this, Nicholas left the room, and in doing so leaving Bruno by himself as he simply smirked and sipped his tea in silence save for one lonesome word. Tease. The United States markets had begun to make a turnaround, and it wasn't Herbert Hoover or his administration that had stabilized the value of the dollar. It was the overwhelming amount of cash flowing into the country from Tyrol. Bruno had acquired enormous swaths of the American market, and in doing so, consolidated control over collapsing businesses, many of which were previously economic titans, splitting them up, merging them into new corporations, and just sometimes gutting them entirely for what little value they offered him. Or I should say that Irwin had done this under Bruno's orders, and he had done it masterfully at that. By 1931, a quarter of all United States businesses and the intellectual property they owned were under Bruno's indirect control. Irwin had established proxies, shell companies, and puppets installed across the board. On paper, there was a trail a mile long that led the ownership of these corporations to anywhere but Germany or another hostile nation. This meant that there was feasibly no way for the United States to prove a quarter of its economic strength was entirely under German control, and that number could be as large as 50% in certain critical industries. Even if they had a suspicion that these were shell corporations that led to the House of Zehntner, litigation would be an impossible feat, and there would be no way to seize the assets without first proving that a hostile state actor, and not a private citizen of a foreign nation that the United States was at war with, was the one in possession of them. Whether it was in accordance with the United States, international, and the law of every country Irwin had established false paper trails to. There was no legal loophole on this planet that the United States government could use to seize the assets he had acquired for his family by taking advantage of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And if they did it illegally, there was an army of lawyers on retainer ready to sue the United States federal and state governments into oblivion. But the United States did not know this, and those who suspected it never voiced their opinion, because it would be political suicide to do so. The United States economy had begun to recover far earlier than in Bruno's past life. The worst had never occurred, but things had gotten bad enough that the American people would turn on any politician who dared to try to undo the progress that had been made these last 2 years simply because it may have been a conspiracy by some Machiavellian mastermind in a foreign country. The people would rather have a shelter over their head, heating in the winter to keep them warm, and food in their bellies than hear the truth. President Herbert Hoover had suspected for some time that Bruno was behind the stabilization of the stock market, but he had yet to find the slightest proof. And he knew that if he dared to pursue it further, his re-election was on the line. His presidency was quite popular right now. The people believed as always that the president was responsible for all the boons and woes a country received. And the people also had short memories. From their perspective, Herbert Hoover had saved the American economy, and that was what ate at the man the most as he sat in the Oval Office, staring at the carpet in front of him. He hadn't done a damn thing. The economy was stabilized because someone bought up a lot of shares and pumped a bunch of money into the country and its redevelopment. It wasn't him. His programs had been a drop in the hat compared to the money that had purchased Standard Oil. There was only one man in the world who could afford to buy the majority shares of America's foremost oil cartel. But he had no proof. On paper, it said the investments had come from all over the country and the world, except conveniently enough the countries that could feasibly lead to seizure of assets in a time of war against the German Reich and its allies. Because of this, Herbert Hoover sat there in silence until finally his cursing echoed across the Oval Office like a ghostly wail. "Damn you,"